I'm going to, are they interesting for the anyway, housekeeping things, so not for the video people. Still, good morning to you as well. Please wear your badges when you're in the building. The toilets are downstairs. No coffee cups in this room, please. What else? There's a Wi-Fi code that you can receive at the reception if you don't have it already. We will use the hashtag Runes of Preservation for Twitter. And hello again, everyone who's on the live stream. We will tweet little summaries of the talks for you if the speakers gave their consent to do that. Also, a little announcement for the speakers of this afternoon. If you have an audio or video file in your presentation, please come and talk to us. We do have loudspeakers. We just need to know whether we should connect them to the computer, but we're obviously happy to play anything related to audio and video files. And other than that, there's lunch again for everyone. You're welcome to stay and help yourself. And so, yeah, this session is about photography and counter archives, and I will briefly introduce Jonas van Mulder, who is our first speaker and who's at the University of Leuven in the Netherlands, and who is a postdoctoral research fellow there. And he's going to talk about the missionary gaze reversed. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers as well to invite me. It's been an interesting and I think important program, and it's really great to be a part of that. I will be talking for the next 20 minutes or so about a rather dark corner of Belgian history and in the history of Congo. The case I will be presenting is kind of a forgotten corner as well, a gap, I would say, in the recent revival of writing and thinking about the colonial past of Belgium and its post-colonial future. What we see here, the black line on the map, is the railroad between Matadi and Leopoldville, later to become Kinshasa. The first one of its kind in Central Africa, and one of the flagship projects of the Leopoldian Congo Free State. The origin of this major enterprise goes back to the assignment by Leopold and his Association Internationale du Congo of the then famed adventurer Henry Morton Stanley in 1879 to prospect possibilities to connect the port of Matadi with, at the mouth of the Congo River, with the village of Leopoldville at Stanley Pool, now Pool Malebo, by land in order to overcome unnavigable parts of the river. The results of these explorations, which were largely framed at the time as a scientific and humanitarian endeavor, would help to contribute to Leopold's favorable position at the Berlin Conference in 1884 that would regulate the European colonization of Africa. As a matter of fact, the disclosure of the African heartland to international trade by connecting Matadi and Leopoldville was was stipulated at the conference as one of the conditions for the declaration of the Congo Free State. The massive undertaking was entrusted to the Belgian industrial Albert Thijs, who struggled to find political and financial support and had to prevent a British initiative from taking shape, but eventually succeeded in establishing the Compagnie du Chemin de Fer de Congo, the Congo Railway Company. In this paper, I will very briefly unpack some of the important ways in which the Matadi-Leopold Railway was connected to colonial politics in Congo in general, and more specifically, how these connections are reflected in an extensive photographic collection of over 600 images that were made or collected by Octave Doge, one of 7 secular clerks from the Diocese of Ghent in Flanders that worked as chaplains along the railway from 92 to 99. The scans I will be showing are from a set of original albumen prints preserved at the Kadok archives in Leuven, a quite typical series in the sense of aesthetics, content, and purpose for what my colleague Luc Vins has called the visual annexation of the Congo by Belgian photographers and visual artists from the 1880s onwards. Images played an important, a central role in the propagandist forum of colonial magazines, exhibitions, world expos, that was created by Leopold and his supporters to demonstrate their colonial ambitions, to encourage Belgian entrepreneurs to invest in the Congo, and more generally to imbue the general public with the idea of a Belgian-Congolese connection, of course, in order to gain more support, more financial support for the colonial project. My central purpose here is to arrive at a more holistic reading of these early missionary photographic collections and to interrogate their, visual excess of the missionary photographs, to use a phrase of Morton and Edwards, so that possibly overlapping, conflicting agendas and experiences become visible. My argument here will be that the Matadi photographs can be approached as a space of oscillating between colonial propaganda and colonial conflicts, colonial critique. It's hardly visible also because the pictures have degenerated a bit. But let us first have a look at the photographers, the Matadi Missionaries. According to the official adulatory account of their mission, published in 1912, the Ghent Bishop Antoine Stillemans gathered and sent out a group of priests to provide religious services to workers of the railway company in 1892. The bishop was prompted to do so by a certain Hipolito Cell, a Belgian politician who would provide material, financial support to the Matadi mission. I will come back to him later. In reality, however, as in many cases, these priests were also, and maybe primarily, actively and directly engaged in activities for the state beyond their evangelical mission, either as intermediaries, surveyors, registers, and photographers in the service of colonial propaganda media. Leopold, who had personally met these priests, was very much supportive of missionary initiative, either Protestant or Catholic, especially in the upper Congolese region, as he believed that the establishment of missions and mission stations would help to open up the country for further commercial exploitation. You can tell from the many photographs in the collection of other mission stations in Brazzaville, Kimenza, Kisantu, Moanda, etc., that the Matadi missionaries were maintaining contact with many other missionaries, and perhaps even creating a network of mission stations in the wider region. Also, when Hipolito Cell, the main sponsor of the Matadi mission, was appointed curator of the Antwerp World Exhibition in 1894, it was probably via the Matadi missionaries that Congolese men and women were selected to be brought to the expo site in Antwerp. You see a picture of those people here. So in short, these priests, missionaries, were playing a wide range of different roles, and these can be seen reflected in this hybrid and extensive photographic collection that they have left us. In order to see how these roles could come into conflict with each other, we need to situate the Matadi mission within the broader perspective of Belgian imperialism and imperialist discourse of the era. A good starting point, again, is Hipolito Cell, the founder and sponsor of the Matadi mission. The man was also a major shareholder of the railway company and a loyal supporter of Leopold's colonial endeavors. Moreover, he was the founder in 1888 of the Belgian anti-slavery society, the Société Anti-Esclavagiste de Belgique, a network largely consisting of Belgian Catholic intellectuals, industrials, politicians, etc. Alongside their evocation of a civilizing mission in Africa, this group heavily denounced so-called Arab slave traders and slave raiders from the continent's east coast. downplaying Europe's own slavery, slave trading past and ignoring the inconsistent implementation of anti-slavery policies, the Anti-Slavery Society presented European operations, both religious and secular, as the answer to the wrongdoings of Afro-Arab slave traders. The idea of a European force that could and should liberate Central Africa from Arab/Muslim influences is clearly, in an appalling way, clearly articulated in an anti-Islam pamphlet written by the Belgian historian Godefroy Kurt, published in 1890 in support of l'œuvre anti-esclavagiste, which was a similar lobby organization founded by the French Cardinal Charles Lavigerie, founder as well of the Missionaries of Africa, and main inspirer of the Belgian Anti-Slavery Society. Just like Kurt and Lavigerie, Hipolito Cell also foresaw a key role for missions and missionaries in anti-slavery actions. His support of the Matadi mission, I think, should also be seen, and this photographic collection, I think, should also be seen in this light. Between 1890 and 1896, the very same period that in the Western Congo, the Matadi Leopoldville Railway was constructed, the Belgian Anti-Slavery Society would support no less than 4 military campaigns against Zanzibar strongholds in the Eastern Congo region. The last of which would be decisive in favor of the Belgian troops. The simultaneity of these two events, of course, was not a coincidence. While the Belgian military campaigns had quite obviously the purpose of gaining more economic control in the east and the north of the Congo, the railway in the west was to become the primary route for exporting resources from the heart of the continent to the coastal harbor of Matadi. Both the railway construction and these Belgian Afro-Arab campaigns are meticulously covered in colonial propaganda media such as the Congo Illustré and Le Mouvement Géographique, which both used pictures from the Matadi photographic collection. In these magazines, both actions are framed as humanitarian initiatives that aimed at liberating and emancipating the Congolese people. Operations of the Congo Free State would salvage them from the yoke of Afro-Arab slave traders and introduce them to the technical innovations of the Industrial Revolution. Many of the defeated Zanzibari chiefs and their servants were exiled, and large groups of so-called liberated villagers by the Belgian army were taken from their homes or slave camps and forced to join the Force Publique, the Congo Free State's military and police force, or were deported to the railway construction site as forced workers. The Matadi photographs give clear evidence of this transportation of people to the west coast. Images show individuals taken as prisoners by the Belgian military captains, identified as chef Arabe, Arab chefs, Bangala, so coming from the northeast of the Congo region. Another photograph claims to be a portrait of the sons of Gongo Lutete, which was a chieftain from eastern Congo who was executed by the Belgian troops in 1893. In Bokala, in the Kwango region, the Matadi missionaries placed their cameras in front of the house of no one else than Rashid bin Mohammed bin Said, the nephew and successor of the notorious Arab Zanzibari chef, probably best known by his Swahili nickname Tipo Tip. Rashid was defeated and exiled to Bokala, where under the supervision, of course, of the colonial governor, he was entrusted with the management of a plantation. Forced labor was widespread in the Congo Free State. In 1890, the American Baptist minister George Washington Williams famously witnessed how so-called volunteers were recruited, often via slave traders, both for porter services and for the colonial army. The appointment of slave traders such as Thibaut in the Upper Congo region well into the 1890s set at odds with the proclaimed anti-slavery sentiments of the Belgian sovereign. So it's becoming clear, I hope, that there were some major contradictions within the Leopoldian colonial project and colonial discourse. A project that was liberating people from slavery but needed slaves to realize its prestigious ventures, that was fighting slave traders but needed them to provide cheap workers, that was building a railway to make an end to the caravan routes but needed thousands of porters for their military campaigns. If the primary goal of visual proof, such as the mission of Matadi Photographs, was to brush off these inconsistencies, they are at the same time also revealing them. Matadi missionary Octave Doge maintained an intensive correspondence with his colleague Jan Janssen, today preserved at the Episcopal Archives in Ghent. In many of these letters, Doge mentions, describes, or even attaches photographs he had taken. At a certain point, Doge starts arranging, numbering, and giving descriptive titles to these photographs, many of which would end up in the final collection. In these letters, Doge often mentions the name of Louis Goffin, who was an engineer from Brussels, who was appointed the General Secretary of the Railway Company in 1892 and became a tireless defender of the railway project towards increasing criticisms leveled by the Belgian Parliament and expressed in the liberal press in Brussels, who deemed the entire project unrealistic, prohibitively expensive and inefficient. Not at least, rumors of inhumane working conditions and frequent accidents made the railroad a highly divisive issue within Belgium between Leopoldian supporters and anti-colonial fractions. So we can easily imagine that Goffin commissioned the Matadi Missionaries to organize their photographs and to provide them with photographs of finished curving rail tracks, sturdy bridges, orchestrated triumphant inaugurations of newly established stations, carefully staged group portraits, and other images that could serve as visual proof that the opposition had it wrong and that the operation was a grand success. There is also a powerful metaphoric or rhetorical quality to the monotonous sequence of interchangeable landscape photos and panoramas that make up a large part of the collection. On the one hand, they illustrate how the medium of photography had helped to construct a colonial concept of wilderness, a cultural tabula rasa that helped to construct the colonial, that supported geopolitical claims of the colony. On the other hand, in this case specifically, the perspective towards the natural, the indefinite, the abstract almost, is consistent to the degree that it almost seems deliberate, that it is the perspective of a viewer who is looking away from something else. In a publication from just 2 months ago, Roy Dilly calls these voids manufactured invisibilities, strategic forms of hiddenness, faintness that can point to contradictions and uncertainties which reveal anxieties and desires of colonial agents that are seldom expressed as such. On the basis of what we know now, we can indeed assume that a humanitarian disaster did indeed occur in between Matadi and Leopoldville. For the construction of a total of 240 miles of railway, an estimated 15,000 forced laborers were recruited locally in Zanzibar, Senegal, Lagos, Accra, Dahomey, Sierra Leone, the Antilles, and Macau. The number of deaths, long-term illnesses, and deserting workers was so high that the construction works had to be stopped continuously. Thousands of workers succumbed to accidents, dysentery, smallpox, malaria, and all this exacerbated by bad food, deplorable living and working circumstances, and maltreatment by the railway militia force. Whereas the official death toll was 1,800 non-whites and 132 whites, other sources estimate that the native death rate was about 2,000 per year for the first 2 years alone. While the Matadi missionaries must have been confronted with this human misery on a daily basis, their photo collection is distinctively silent about this. However, their preserved correspondence clearly shows that they were very well informed about the problematic humanitarian situation both in the Upper Congo and along the railway. In a letter dated on January 8, 1896, the Matadi missionary Emil B Hills wrote to the Bishop of Ghent about things he had himself seen or heard from others. He complained about the increasing moral laxity of the colonial agents, some of them really prominent figures. He names polygamy, alcoholism, and disrespect of religious ritual. Still with disbelief, he describes colonial officers in 1894 leaving Mass in a procession, venerating a bottle of beer as the Holy Sacrament. Yet more importantly, he also criticizes the inhuman, excessive use of the chicotte, the whip, on workers, and writes that he has heard about practices of cutting off hands and feet as punishments in the rubber harvest in the province of Upper Congo, and that in the region of Équateur in the northwest, more than 1,000 people have been killed in the rubber extraction. Reliable sources assured him that King Leopold II knew about the situation. In one word, Monseigneur B Hills writes, the general opinion is that terrible things are happening over here. It would take another 10 years before the publications of British and Belgian inquiries into the atrocities of the Congo, known as the Roger Casement's report and the Janssens Commission, would officially acknowledge widespread abuses in 1994 and 5. The rapid growth, of course, in the infamous rubber trade from around 1890 onwards was a major development which increased both the level of the atrocities in Congo and the criticisms of them. Missionaries shared in this critique, for they failed to speak out against the atrocities that they witnessed on a daily basis. The work of Kevin Grant, Jack Thompson, and others has shown how atrocity photographs by American Presbyterians and British Baptist Mission societies played a major role in alerting the British and the American public opinion to the stark realities of Leopold's policies and the rubber industry in particular. Just going back to this one to end up, knowing that these Matadi missionaries knew about the situation really charges some of the more challenging photographs in this collection with other associations, with other meanings beyond the purely propagandist. The photograph shown here, for instance, of 3 workers in a stock in Kamansuki might suggest that the Matadi missionaries were not only interested in dressing Leopold's showcase, but were also inserting carefully and minimally images that had the capacity to elicit reactions. I end with a phrase of Janet Bastian, to reverse the missionary gaze and to gain more insight into local realities experienced by those without power and the right for self-representation. Paradoxically, in this case, asks for methods that engage with the personal accounts of colonial agents, of missionary agents, and immerse into their perspective. Bastian wrote that the voiceless of the archives are not silent witnesses, but full partners in the record-creating process, and it is only by reading against the grain of the archives, a counter-archival reading, that we might find the whispers of the colonized in the records of the colonizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas, and also welcome everyone who just joined us. I always forget to say my name. I'm Miriam Brusius. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute in Global and Colonial History, and also historian of photography, which is why I'm thrilled to chair this session. And our last speaker for this session is Colin Sterling, who is a postdoctoral fellow at UCL.
Hi, morning everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm going to start with a couple of apologies. So apology number 1, to anyone who's heard this talk before or a version of it, because I've been rethinking heritage and photography for about 8 or 9 years now. You'd think it would all be thunk by now, but no, there's still more to do, in my opinion. But I do feel like there is light at the end of the tunnel, because I have a book coming out based on this research in September. So I haven't actually put up a thing of it. I should have put a picture of it. But it's called Heritage Photography and the Effective Past. Available to pre-order from Walmart, as I discovered recently. So, yeah. The other apology is that this talk is it's in 2 parts, and the first part is very citation heavy. So I'm going to put up loads of words and quite dense words, but I'm going to try and navigate through them in a fairly nice way, hopefully, so I apologize for that. But my starting point today is a quote. It's a quote from Victor Bergin, who's a photo theorist, some of you may know. And it's a bit of a throwaway line in a book of his that isn't very good. It's not a very interesting photo book called Voyage to Italy. It's kind of very boring pictures of Pompeii. But he has this quote that just resonated with me and has stayed with me for a very long time. Every photograph is the trace of a previous state of the world, a vestige of how things were. The sum of all photographs is the ruin of the world. So this is pretty evocative, a bit kind of enigmatic even, and a useful starting point for me from which to ask if photo archives and photographs do indeed constitute a ruin, how might this ruin actually function in the world? What kind of work might this kind of ruin perform, and how might it be conceptualized in relation to heritage? And I imagine the kind of thing that Bergin had in mind when he was writing this is usefully visualized by Eric Kessel's 2011 work, 24 Hours in Photographs, which is a printout of every image uploaded to Flickr in a 24-hour period. So this is 2011, and I think this is like almost quaint now. So he's installed this piece in various kind of churches and buildings around the world, and it's just a pile of prints, basically. And as I say, it's probably always quaint now. If you to do this today with Instagram or something like that, I'm sure it would be an even more ginormous pile of pictures. And I was thinking of this in relation to Johnny's talk yesterday, thinking this is actually probably more rubble than ruin. But as I think it kind of visualizes this idea of the mass of photographs. So there are other ways to think with the ruin, however. So part 1 of my talk is explores 3 of these, basically, in an attempt to triangulate some kind of theory of ruination that might provoke a different orientation when it comes to photography, heritage, and preservation. And then part 2 applies this to a couple of case studies. So, hopefully I don't need to kind of tell this room that any encounter with ruin theory can lead in many multiple directions at once. And these are just some of the authors that I've kind of engaged with over the past few years to think through the topic of ruins and ruination. And in a way, selecting 3 conceptual anchors for this kind of work is always going to be fairly arbitrary. But working against some of the more familiar voices around this topic, so the Benjamins, the Edensaws, the Ruskins, the Dylans, and looking across different disciplinary perspectives than we're perhaps used to, the constellation I want to pick out today brings three works together, 3 authors, Yale Navarro Yashin, Anne Stoller, and Anna Singh. So a couple of anthropologists dealing with very different socio-political contexts, and a historian of empire and colonialism. And I'm increasingly thinking of academia as kind of like navigating by the stars, where basically you just look up and there's this whole massive range of things that you must read or that you've read, and you've got like thousands of notes, and it's like, well, what do I pick out? You know, where do I go? How do I chart a path through this? So this is me charting a path and navigating through ruination in relation to these 3 authors. More specifically, I'm doing this, I'm drawing here on 3 specific texts or projects of these Writers, Stoller, of course, Imperial Debris, 2008 paper, which then became a 2013 edited volume. Navarro Yashin's work on affect and melancholy in Turkey and northern Cyprus, again a 2009 paper and then a 2012 book. And then Anna Singh's Mushroom Project from 2015, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And I found these very inspiring and generative and challenging at different times and in relation to different projects that I've been involved in. And I want to try and bring them together here almost just to see what happens in this concatenation of these ideas and to see where it might take us in relation to preservation, photography, etc. So I want to dive straight in to Stoller's work. In Imperial Debris, is that kind of legible, the yellow, slightly? I'll read it out anyway. In Imperial Debris, we learn that ruination is a corrosive process that weighs on the future and shapes the present. To think with the ruins of empire, then, Stoller argues, is to attend to the reappropriation and strategic positioning of what may seem dead or defunct within the politics of the present. And she's very interested in how things linger and the afterlives and aftershocks of different things, materials, practices, structures, systems, images, and so on. Such ruins may then become epicenters of renewed claims that might animate new possibilities and unexpected political projects. Already then we're in quite a different ball game here than Bergin's kind of conceptualization of the ruin. The mass of photos that he's thinking with may well weigh on the future and the present, but there are always opportunities for strategic repositioning and reanimation. What Navarro Yashin brings to this, then, is an awareness that knowledge production itself is subject to ruination, to the piling of debris behind us, as she says. And here she's drawing on Benjamin's concept, of course. And her particular interest in the affective turn and its apparent dismissal of discourse is the kind of framework for how she thinks through this. This is misguided, according to Navarro Yashin. And she uses the figure of the ruin as a bridge between discourse and affect. A ruin, she argues, is rhizomatic or rhizomatic in the sense that it grows in uncontrollable and unforeseen ways. But a ruin is also about roots. It is remembered, it is kept, lamented, and cherished in the memory of those who left it behind. It is cited and noticed by those who uncannily live in or in its vicinity. It leaves marks in the unconscious. Here then we can think of the typical picture of ruins that we might all imagine when we think of this word, or indeed of archives or photographs, which are all kind of affective. They discharge an affect of melancholy, but they are also put into discourse by people who symbolize them, interpret them, politicize them, historicize them, and so on. So in relation to heritage and photography, we might say that ruins and ruination allow us to understand the work that certain things, places, images perform in the world. They are rooted and rhizomatic, things that we both construct in some sense, but that also leave marks in the unconscious. Okay, finally, I did warn you, lots of citations at the front. Uploading with citations, what I always do. So Anna Singh, in her wonderful book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, follows the path of the Matsutake mushroom through what she describes as the blasted landscapes that allow us to explore the ruin that has become our collective home. In this ruin, which is a product of capitalism, as Singh says, all our lives are now precarious, as individual and communities across North and South confront what Singh calls trouble without end. One of the main signals and causes of this trouble is the failure of progress, and this came up a little bit in the discussion yesterday. Without progress, Singh suggests, the ruin glares at us with the horror of its abandonment. But it is here, as Singh's book explores, that human and non-human collaborations emerge on the overgrown verges of our blasted landscape, or the edges of capitalist discipline. As Singh concludes, We are stuck with the problem of living despite economic and ecological ruination. Neither tales of progress nor tales of ruin tell us how to think about collaborative survival. So I hope you will forgive that wordy overview of three incredibly dense and rewarding projects that I've no doubt absolutely butchered in the retelling there, but we can pause to recap our ruinous navigation briefly here. So with Stoller, we have a focus on process and lingering effects, what she calls aftershocks and afterlives. These ruins may, however, be actively repositioned to enable spirited reanimation. With Navarro Yashin, we find that ruins are always discursive and affective, rooted and rhizomatic, sighted yet uncontrollable. Whether spatial or material, such ruins are always relational and dialogic, to use one of Rodney's terms. Finally, with Singh, we are placed in a position where the ruin is our collective home. This figuration is emblematic of a world in which progress has failed and we have a shared sense of precarity. Survival for Singh means looking to more than human collaborations at the edges of capitalist ruin, which is a point I'll kind of return to later. Okay, so we've been breathing some pretty rarefied abstract air so far in this navigation, and I think it's time to bring it down to earth, bring it down with what is perhaps a slightly bumpy landing with some empirical case study work. So the sites I want to bring these concepts into dialogue around are Angkor World Heritage Site in Cambodia, which is a place I'm sure many of you know, and the city of Famagusta in Cyprus and its related, so there's a medieval walled city and a modern town of Varosha, which I'll also talk about a little bit. So why these places? Well, there's a whole host of interesting things going on across both. In terms of preservation, post-conflict memory, tourism, and so on. But they also have this strange historical connection in the work of Scottish photographer John Thompson, who was a Victorian, very well-known Victorian photographer, colonialist, geographer, lots of different things in his work. And he was the first person to ever photograph Angkor in 1866. And he was the first British photographer to visit Cyprus and document the island in 1878, when it became a de facto colony of Britain. So I kind of used this historical moment as a jumping off point to think what role photography has played in relation to both these places. So we have then ruinous photographies on top of ruinous sites. We have imperial debris and melancholic affective spaces and sites where the ruin as a collective home becomes all too apparent and extremely important in thinking through what preservation does in these places. And these may challenge dominant narratives that pair preservation and progress. In relation to imperial debris, we might look towards the highly visible reuse of some of the colonial archives in interpretation at Angkor. I'm going to go through these examples very quickly. So the reuse of the École François I can never remember it, EFEO archives at Angkor. Or we might have these kind of much more everyday collections that are actually in the same official archive, but dealt with in a completely different way from the 1990s post-Khmer Rouge period when the EFEO came back in and worked to preserve the site. And they're actually stored in these kind of family albums at the archive on site. Or we might look to the lingering effects of images that were taken to document Famagusta by the British, and to think with the work that collection at the National Archives is now doing, but also the use of John Thompson's photographs on the cover of a menu at Historia Restaurant in the city centre. And so what kind of work are these things doing in different contexts? Does it constitute an active repositioning, or is it just the kind of entanglement of photographs and preservation in the patterns of consumption? I think that's probably true of the last one there. A more kind of direct, clear example of what we might call active repositioning is around the Famagusta Association of Great Britain's archive, which is collected by a Greek Cypriot diaspora community based mostly in London, and they collect old photographs, postcards of Famagusta as a kind of advocacy for the return of Northern Cyprus or the reuniting of the island. So it's a very political use of historic and contemporary images. We might also look to the kind of work that Michael Faust has been doing around Angkor and the French colonial imagination and the use of postcards as a kind of mode of critical inquiry to think through the kinds of heritage imaginations and heritage products and processes and appropriations that photography was enacting for a very long time. And of course, both Angkor and Famagusta are open to various contemporary visual projections. So these are a couple of my pictures, especially those that might draw out their melancholic affective qualities. To what extent, I think this is a key question for any photography around ruins, to what extent does ruin porn engage critically with ruination as a force in the world? Not much, I would say. Connected to this, photography is, of course, bound up with tourism as an economic driver, which is also one of the main factors underpinning preservation initiatives, of course. Preservation, then, is deeply entangled with the progress narratives of modernity and capitalism. What does heritage look like, I want to ask? What images might it convey, and what images might it be entangled with, to think in the opposite direction, to recognise the ruin as our collective home and preservation and precarity as combined. To think heritage, in other words, across precarity at different scales, at different times, and in varied socio-political contexts. One task here is surely to look to what Singh would call the blasted verges of our carefully preserved progress landscapes. And I use the word advisedly here, but I think these may ultimately constitute the real ruin of the world, where the simple fact of holding on seems to say so much more about our current predicament, our collective ruin, than the fetishistic work of preserving ever could. What on earth am I trying to say with all this? I don't really know yet. Having done this work for like 9 or 10 years, I still don't really know what I think of heritage and photography. And I was going to put up a whole list of questions here, but then I couldn't even think what questions I would be asking because I've had too many questions. But I think the most obvious point is the ruination that Bergen is probably hinting at is all too evident when we look around us, but it's also much more complex than he probably imagined in his slightly throwaway comment. And the moment we start to think with ruin in any serious way, a whole raft of troubling, illuminating, and challenging possibilities comes into view. Photography and the photographic archive, very broadly understood, as I'm sure has come across here, are vital interlocutors when it comes to navigating ruination in all its myriad forms. And this must move beyond this kind of seductive idea of the mass or excess or accumulation to something more precise, I think. I don't know if I've quite nailed the landing there. I don't think so. But I do want to leave the last word to Singh to drive home the point that the picture of ruination I've sketched out here is not some hopeless, melancholic navel-gazing, which I'm sure I could be accused of, and that if we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin. Thank you.
Come to the front and sit here.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Can I just start off with 2 questions? I try and be brief, and I need to ask everyone else to also be brief because we only have 20 minutes. To engage with 3 truly inspiring papers. I thought it was interesting, again, as Rachel did yesterday, how you used historical research in order to drive new methodologies and contemporary practices. I also thought it was interesting how you all use the word counter-archive, and kind of assuming that there is an archive, while, for example, in the case of Hebbar, it's very fluid. You talked about social media, and so I suppose my question would be, also drawing on Karen Sol's keynote yesterday morning, where does this knowledge sit, and where should it sit in the future? Can we talk about an archive at all, or should we talk about an archive? And then, because this is very material-based, and also your talks were very focused on the material, we still haven't talked so much about people and how we can identify people who are actually on the photographs. I know you did this in Hebbar, you did this in your exhibition, and so I thought maybe you all have some thoughts on that. Yeah. Anyone?
Well, I can say a little thing about that. I came across this collection when I was preparing a small exhibition that tried to show how so-called Arab cultures, Islam, was present in sources that we have that were Catholic sources, where we weren't really expecting them, but they were there, and we were trying to ask what is the meaning of those images and texts in these sources where we encounter them. And actually I did this with my colleague who knows this collection from the beginning of the 90s. And he had to admit he had never really looked at each photograph individually, where some of them really have captions, some of them really say this is this person in this place, but they're so generic in a way. They're so cliche that he never had in mind, and neither did his colleagues, to look at those people themselves. So, and the sources that I found just 2 weeks ago in the Episcopal Archives in Ghent, they help us to do that, but it's hard to find them because they're somewhere behind very general descriptions in the catalog that make it very hard to connect with the photographic collection that these sources talk about. So a way to help that is to make better or to make more inclusive descriptions of archival funds and translate them, because, for example, the research into atrocity photography is something that is very much done in the Americas and England, and not really within Belgium and the Netherlands, because of course Catholic photographs, they are supporting the Colonial project. They, at face value, they don't seem to critique in a way. So a translation and a publication online or so might help to connect with other researchers within the field. That's just a quick thought.
I think I didn't have a chance to say that in my talk because I felt I had to stay on time. But something that can everyone hear me? Something that we were attempting to do, and that's a follow-on project with Alice Stevenson and myself, is how we can convert this archive, the archives that we've got with the, let's say, with the biases it holds, and how we can create an ongoing counter-archive by gathering contemporary, current responses to the archive that exists today, through having some sort of activities that are not necessarily only engaging in a top-down type of engagement with the archive, but in converting the knowledge that has been created by, let's say, the artifacts of excavation project that we're using as the base of our Egypt and its dispersed heritage views from Egypt project, is how we can convert this archive that we've got into practical knowledge, and this practical knowledge can itself serve into a counter archive that can be then integrated into museum displays, and also can be perhaps responses from Egyptians into the existing archive today that we've got in the museums, that we can include it into the databases. We were thinking of making some sort of like school packs talking about the journeys of objects from Egypt to the rest of the world, and how this can contribute to let's say, out of the classroom activities and contribute to Egypt's attempt to modernize their education, and also an attempt of social inclusion. We're trying to reach out to communities that are usually are not the museum goers for various social and economic reasons, but to take the archive to them would be a sense of, first of all, recognition of their voice, their importance of their voice, but at the same time to give them some sort of social agency that their views also are accountable of and they are interesting, and to bring all those voices back to Egypt, back to the UK, to be integrated into displays and archives here. I think that what we need to think about is that outside this room, like, archives are not only for research, they are not only to produce knowledge that is very academic. They are, first and foremost, they belong to the people. These are stories, like, these are histories of the people. And we need to find a way that how this injustice can become just by giving people more agency over the existing archive and giving them the chance to counter the archive themselves, rather than us leading them always, like us giving down knowledge into them, but give them agency to make up their own knowledge of the archive too.
You also gave some historical characters agency.
Yes.
Can you just say 2 sentences about that, about the exhibition that you did in the Petrie Museum?
Yes.
Because they were digging, and many didn't put a name to them. And
yes, the problems with the archive is that, like, whoever is taking the photograph on the other side, let's say in the case of Petrie, they are the ones who define who gets named or who gets photographed. And there was an interesting, I think that's the story that Miriam is referring to. There was an interesting story about that was a site in Tanis, that's a site in north of Egypt, and that was the first time that Petrie ever went to this site. And given the economical status there, people were really in deep need of work. And obviously, while there are restrictions to girls in rural Egypt, but when it comes to economic contribution, magically those restrictions tend to dissolve. So girls are allowed outside the house only if they are bringing money into the family. So one of the girls, and because this was the first time ever for Petrie on the site, she was not very sure whether Petrie tends to employ women or girls or not. So she queued together with the boys, but she was dressed up like a girl. And when it came to her name, she decided to call herself Muhammad Hassan. Muhammad is obviously a man name. And perhaps it was this her own way of ensuring that she gets a job with Petrie on the field. That is how Petrie found her interesting. And she's one of the only girls that get a photograph by herself. So interestingly, the discrimination against her, or how she thought that she was discriminated against, and how she gave herself agency by calling herself a man, that is the only way that made her end up into the archive today. But interestingly, neither did Petrie nor did his Egyptian head of the workforce ask the girl what her real name is. So till today, she's called Muhammad Hassan. So, but at least she exists. At least she got the chance, like, to have her photograph put in the Petrie. Like, her memory still exists today, even if she's called Muhammad. Maybe that name gave her agency at the end. But
do you want to add anything?
Yeah, a couple of very quick things. So I think that I don't think I did use the word counter archive.
Okay, sorry.
And I don't know why I
was
didn't
projecting
now.
it.
Yeah. I think, just very simply, I think every archive contains its own counter archive, and I worry that playing the game of the archival label actually stops some level of alternative way of thinking about the stuff that the world contains. Because I think there's a real trend of, if you don't have a museum and you want it to be something political, call it a museum. If you don't have an archive and you want it to be something political, call it an archive. So I wonder how else you might actually term those things and what that might do differently. And I don't have an answer for that. And then your first thing about the use of historic collections as a methodology, I mean, that was absolutely central to my entire research and always will be, and I think always should be. And one of the key things was just to understand there's a very limited repertoire if you look at standard photographic practices of what gets taken at a site. and to trace back where those things emerge from and why they emerge at different times, and then to think how can the same photograph from or the same visuality from 1866 and 2019 be doing very different things, but also actually quite often the same thing over and over and over again, and it comes back to your idea of cliche. That's often what we're dealing with in the mass of photographs.
Okay, I already have a few people on my list who put their hands up quite quickly. Wendy.
So I'm just going to stand to see you. Thank you very much. It was a really fascinating panel. I have questions for Jacob and for Heba. So, Jacob, I was wondering, in looking at the photographs, you're reading them as counter photographs. And I can see that reading, but I can also see, thinking through how a lot of Americans seem to be responding to the concentration camps of children, how people are also seeing, well, it's a sad violence, but it's a legitimate violence. That is also, seems to me that those photographs are very ambivalent in terms of their sort of considering it tragic, but perhaps necessary. And I was wondering how the text perhaps mediates or doesn't mediate that ambivalence. For Heba, I was really fascinated by so much of that. There's so much to say. But I was thinking about how the ownership of objects always acts for a proxy of power. And therefore, taking objects to the center of empire is a proxy of imperialism. So therefore, repatriation is a proxy for the end of imperialism. The thing is that it seems to me that what you're talking about is about the role of the museum in general, globally, as a surrogate for democracy. That is, we own your stuff, and therefore, you are part of us. Yeah. And so I was wondering how you conceive of your desire to have ownership by the people in relation to a struggle for a broader democratic voice, and whether in the absence of that existence of democracy, and not just in Egypt, but in many places, how can what you're proposing function without that much broader understanding of a flatter hierarchy? Thank you.
I will give a very short answer because it's research that I still have to do. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that, of course, within the magazines, the books in which these pictures were used in the 1890s, I guess, of course, they connected to the colonial narrative that said we're, actually they do that, we're helping these people by showing them how to work. That's what the sources say. In the beginning, they didn't recruit local people because they were lazy, they wouldn't work. So that's why we're going to look for workers elsewhere. So I guess in that narrative, people being locked in a stock can make sense, of course. We have to learn on how to work. But when these pictures were offered in four series to the archive, to the Bishop of Ghent, to Hipolito Cell, we were already in 1912 when most of the people knew about what happened. This is a myth in Belgian historiography that people didn't know. It's a common myth, and it also it's still very much alive today in history writing in Belgium. So I do want to look for the reception of these photographs of what the priests wrote in the 1910s, in the 1920s, to look how these pictures get a different response or are being read in a different way. This is something that I still have to do, but I think I will find some responses to that, certainly in the more liberal press, the press and the writings that opposed, that were already opposing Leopold's Congo Free State in the 1890s. Another myth, of course, that there was a big difference between 98, when Congo became Belgian, and the Congo Free State. There were much more continuities, of course, than there were shifts. So the opposition remained, and I want to look for the role of these pictures in the opposition. So, but it's a good, good suggestion.
Well, it's a very difficult question, I have to say, but it's a very important and very interesting question that Like, it's something that I always think about all the time, but I think that a museum is a place, essentially, not necessarily for us as Egyptians or for anyone, it's a place where you can bring in justice. I think this is what a museum should be. This is a place that is meant to be for the public, it's meant to be for everyone, so it should serve the needs and the aims of everyone. What I think that it's very important today, especially for the case of Egypt and for the case of broader Middle East and for someone who's lived in the West for quite some time, we are quite invisible. And no matter how we try to be visible, we remain invisible. People can take up the streets in the millions, make revolutions, revolt, but for some reason we remain absolutely unseen. Or we are only seen through a political framework that doesn't necessarily represent all of us, that the multivocality of us is unseen. On the other hand, we are also seen as a collective. So for example, I'm usually seen as a representative of the whole Egypt, which is not true. Like, it's a country of 100 million. Like, I couldn't represent the whole of Egyptians, and I couldn't be representative of all Middle Eastern women or all Muslim women. There is this conception of us as one uniform collective rather than individual people. And I think what a museum can do today and what archaeology or the heritage can do today is try to, first of all, deconstruct that absolute isolation between our ancient history and our modern history, or at least recontextualize the variety of layers that exist of history in the Middle East. Whenever you go to any ancient Egyptian gallery, you think that, like, ancient Egypt is this, like, concept that this is not a real country, this is not a real place where people still live today. And then when you go to actual modern Egypt, you'll be shocked, because the image that you would see in the museum has nothing to do with the reality, has nothing to do with what exists in real life. And this is one of the reasons why I think, like, political institutions or the government tend to segregate touristic sites, because to preserve this Western fantasy image of ancient Egypt by keeping us more and more, us as modern Egyptians, isolated from the sites. One way that museums can help, or the discourse of heritage itself can help, is to actually acknowledge the Middle East, first of all, the link between the past and the present of the Middle East, and to make sure that the various layers of history are also well represented, but in a way that is coherent, because you would go to, let's say, the British Museum, you would see ancient Egyptian objects in the Ancient Egypt Gallery, and then you would see, again, Egyptian objects, but in the Islamic Gallery. For the average visitor, that you would never make the link, that these all come from one country, belong to one nation or one culture. But I don't know, making a one Egypt museum, that would be difficult, or a one Middle East museum, that would be difficult, but try to find ways of displaying the multiplicity of layers in a way that is more coherent, and bring in more voices. And I think this is something that has been happening, let's say, in Australia, in America, with the natives or with the indigenous, but this never happens with Middle Eastern communities, and there are plenty of immigrants, not only with the current refugee crisis, but that has been historically from the early 20th century. There's been, like, Europe is full of immigrants from the Middle East, but there's never been any attempt of including the voices of Middle Eastern communities in museum displays. They were never invited for, like, community curation, except recently, but that's also for the refugee integration. So you would feel that this is more or less something that a massive catastrophe has to happen for us to be seen once again. But just acknowledging the link between us and our past and making sure that we are also included in the conversation, I think can help also, like, more or less counter-archive, or perhaps counteract the many stereotypes that exist in the West about the Middle East too. So I don't know if this answers your question.
We're already out of time, and I have more people on the list, but there's a coffee break to talk more. I know Rodney was next. Is yours very, very short? Or it was a long one? What do you want to do with it?
I have a short one. Just about your images, and I just really wonder about the impact of the images on the contemporary audience, especially when it's becoming more diverse and hopefully more emotionally literate.
Yeah.
But just thinking about the afterlife of the images,
Yeah.
and whether the subjects are talking to us through our emotions.
That's it's a difficult question because I don't see myself necessarily as a primary viewer of these photographs. I see myself as a researcher. But I was just telling that after my presentation, I had a very hard time putting these photographs in the PowerPoint presentation, making them look nice. It's a difficult question. All these photographs can be found online with watermarks, so they're there. You can enter them as many times as you want, from where you want. But it's a next step to look to see how digitizing this kind of material can affect viewers and people that are not necessarily looking to them from a researcher point of view. That's ongoing thought. I don't have an answer to that.
Okay. Thank you very much for making some really important points in the paper, but also just now on the panel, also within the larger framework of the counter-archive theme. We have a coffee break until 11:30, and then we will hear the keynote by Trinidad Rico. Please be back on time. Thank you.
More than the rest of us. I've seen you.
Anthropology at Stanford University, and Trinidad's work ranges across a number of different themes that are directly relevant to the symposium today. Her work has been really important in helping us to understand the ways in which heritage is motivated and defined by risk and endangerment. Her monograph on this issue, Constructing Destruction, Heritage Narratives in the Tsunami City, was published in 2016 by Routledge in the UCL Institute of Archaeology, Critical Cultural Heritage Studies. But her work has also ranged across a series of other issues that are of relevance today, issues of rumor, secrecy, and contradiction, and her final keynote presentation, which she'll be delivering this morning, is called Heritage Archives and the Unsaid, Rumor, Secrecy, and Contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Miriam and Rodney for inviting me to somewhat close this event. Very jet-lagged, I'm very dehydrated, so I'm sorry about this. So I'm going to read as well, because I lose my train of thought in English if I don't, and I didn't test this, I'm afraid. Yay! Oh, now you know the punchline, I'm sorry. It's a bit overwhelming to be the third keynote when the other keynotes have set the bar so high, so I'm going to do my best to wrap up some themes, if I can. Almost 20 years ago, when I was training to become an archaeologist, I took a drawing class at the Museum of Classical Archaeology of the University of Cambridge. Throughout this course, we were instructed to do the following. Don't draw the statue, draw the empty spaces around the statue. That is, the empty spaces between the volumes. There you go. I'm sad to report that this did not help me learn how to draw or to make better PowerPoint presentations, but the directive to focus on the spaces in between things remained. This is particularly true when it comes to teaching methods in heritage studies. I tell my students to study preservation practices as if we were studying the empty spaces between things. Sociologist Eviatar Zerubbabel would call this a study of the unmarked, as opposed to the culturally marked. This contrast explains the distinction between what is explicitly accentuated, in this case the vase, and that which is unarticulated, effectively what is taken for granted. So today I want to invite you to consider how much we take for granted in the study of heritage and preservation practices, and the significant implications that this has for the growth of the field and the support that it can provide to the study of empty spaces, the marginal, that which propels the construction or seeking a counter-archive. In practical terms, I ask, what exactly is left out of the archive of heritage value through our existing methodological approaches to the study of heritage and preservation practices? I wonder really where the field should go next, so that I can say something at the end. But this is not something that I promise to resolve today, unfortunately. In Zerubbabel's words again, studying the taken for granted involves the epistemic challenge of having to observe absence, thereby making it methodologically elusive. Acts of omission, after all, are much harder to notice than acts of commission, but that is precisely what we have been discussing since yesterday. Now, I never took a methods class in heritage studies per se, and I don't know many programs that do methods except perhaps Rachel and me. Hi. which is what we're trying to do. Because I was trained in archaeological ethnography, or coming from social archaeology to be more precise. The study of heritage and preservation practices, however, remains a mashup of approaches. And this is not a problem in a field that continuously tries to fill in empty spaces, because there's still a lot of ground to cover. However, I would argue that what is a problem is the little attention that is paid to the holes in the archive that are perpetuated by our existing approaches. Dennis Byrne wrote in his book Surface Collection that no amount of archaeological skill or sensibility will be enough to decode terrain encrypted at this intimate level. He's talking about our ability to read cultural landscapes that are largely constructed on traces of meaning that are suppressed and buried underground. His work disrupts the idea that heritage value exists on the surface as an observable quality. And luckily, the growth of different methodologies applied to the study of heritage preservation has somehow taken on this challenge to some extent over the decades. Methodological approaches to the study of heritage simultaneously produce and are produced by specific archives that contain heritage value, and that's why we do what we do. In the simplest of terms, the way I explain it to my students, a methodological approach to the study of heritage that aims to capture color will result in an archive that contains color. And I know this sounds really simple, but it will result in an archive that contains color and nothing else. All other properties will become second class to the property of color, or maybe they won't even exist, they won't be documented. Right, so books will be written about color. The World Heritage designation of a site will revolve around color. Munsell color charts will be sold out constantly, it would be weird. Now, not that far from this rainbow dystopia, the study of heritage value begins as a study that leans heavily on aesthetics. I'm just going to review methods that you already know to make a point. So this is an emphasis on style, integrity, and earlier iterations of authenticity that were very visual assessments. And the study of heritage here originates and still remains a heavily visual field, so I'm quite glad that I follow the whole session on photography, right? Therefore, it's no surprise that the vast majority of methodological approaches center on the documentation of 2- and 3-dimensional features. Wow, maybe the contrast. I hope it looks better on the streaming. No matter what level of precision is allowed by specific approaches, they mostly capture surface features. I say mostly because they also kind of capture time. They capture surface features at a precise moment or at a very precise or defined period of time through maybe time-lapse video or something, or walking through a site, right? So we're capturing the surface in whatever time of engagement we have with the heritage site. And so the visual archive of heritage value is quite rich. Simply think about how many heritage sites you can identify from their appearance, even if you have never experienced it or them yourselves, right? So we're quite familiar with the visual cue of something being heritage. It looks a certain way. But to access heritage value in other temporal contexts, we have to resort to other archival, historical, or social sources and methodologies. Much of the critical turn in heritage studies has revolved around recognizing how challenging this is. But reading heritage value in this type of archive works best if, or only, when heritage value is in alignment with official histories. Challenging official histories, the archives that hold them, and the experts that promote them results in better support for the study of heritage of marginal and oppressed groups. In fact, I would argue that this concern has put heritage at odds with history in many ways, and I think that was one of the things that propelled me talking to Rodney and Miriam about this, about how do we actually bring back history in productive ways so that we're not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm thinking about the many ways in which things get erased. When the cameras are off, ask me about this picture here of the burnt archive. The study of the marginal, therefore, relies more heavily on maybe folklore studies, ethnographic studies, and other participatory approaches that have become much more popular in heritage studies, depending on the temporal growth scale that is desired. As these approaches rely increasingly more and more on social constructions of heritage, a contemporary archive of heritage value becomes populated, one that is more dynamic and heterogeneous. But this doesn't resolve the main issue that I want to address today. That is the assumption in heritage studies that presumes that heritage value is democratically constructed, accessible, and permanent. In this sense, I will argue the field never moved forward from its expert-led construction of the archive. The examples I'm going to bring up right now are not going to be earth-shattering for many of you, because anyone who's been practicing heritage methods with any level of reflexivity has already reached the same conclusions that I've reached. So if that's the case, just look at the pretty pictures or play Candy Crush. So the first little journey I'm going to take you on is to Indonesia, starting in 2004. Now, a subaquatic earthquake off the coast of Sumatra caused a devastating series of tsunami waves that spread across the Indian Ocean in all directions from the epicenter, affecting 14 countries. Immediately following this event, international organizations concerned with heritage safeguarding paid particular attention to the status of the Fort of Gal, the one World Heritage Site on this map that's in the southern coast of Sri Lanka, which is here. No, I lost my way. Okay. Much closer to the epicenter, the coastal city of Banda Aceh in Indonesia suffered devastating destruction. Surprisingly, the cultural heritage and historic resources of the Aceh province fared relatively well. Many of the historic resources that had already been known and identified in this region suffered relatively mild damage. So the picture at the bottom is kind of the prototypical post-tsunami landscape that was documented immediately after the disaster. But then at the top we have the Rumah Aceh, which is a traditional house that's preserved as a sort of museum, and the Baitur Rahman Grand Mosque, which also did quite well. And I think it's a reflection, obviously, of better construction, either location or better construction styles. There were also quite a lot of Dutch colonial structures that stood up to the forces of the tsunami. Outside of the reach of international heritage organizations, who are the usual suspects that would get involved here, but they were too concerned with what was happening in Sri Lanka at the time. Local organizations carried out condition assessments of these particular resources, like these up there, and the Dutch resources, or the Dutch historical remains. This focus would suggest that the emphasis of post-disaster heritage preservation work was concerned with pre-disaster heritage assemblages. So what they're accessing at that moment is a heritage value that existed in the past historically, right? So it's documented through an awareness of a historical process. Now, this approach underscores the significance of historical depth and authenticity of heritage assemblages, and it also harks back to an important axiom behind many forms of heritage preservation, which is the idea that cultural heritage heals, and it heals by connecting you to the past, to your historical archive. This dominant rhetoric posits that what has already been identified as having heritage value is integral to the well-being of a people because the familiar or known in the landscape matters and is better than the contemporary. This is the axiom that puts the significance of historical archives center stage. But total or near destruction in Aceh was spread across contemporary landscapes and cityscapes, and so I spent 5 years exclaiming to anyone who wanted to listen, I don't do archives, guys. Confronting ordinary landscapes in the form of rubble as they endured aggressive cleanup was the time to identify, highlight, and take remedial action towards the valuable and to discard the invaluable in very real time. So you could make this decision, you could watch decisions happen constantly on a daily basis. I documented this context, in this context, a different concern for post-disaster heritage reconstruction work, the sudden and perhaps somewhat unpredictable emergence of new heritage. For example, this tsunami boat that I studied for a period of 5 years. The process of heritageization here started with the appearance of graffiti that identified these sites as valuable in the days and weeks, like mere days and weeks following the disaster. So that this graffiti here that I've blown up that says "Stone Broken," and then it says a tsunami, and then the date and the precise time in which they experienced the tsunami wave at that particular part of the city. Later, this message was somewhat formalized through signage, substantial stabilization measures, and repairs over time, even adding a viewing platform, and now this becoming, the final seal of this being that it became part of heritage trails and school tours, and it becomes part of almost like the curriculum of contemporary history of Aceh. Becoming a centerpiece of an emerging post-tsunami heritage and tourism industry, the care taken to preserve this heritage/memorial suggests that the fabrication of heritage icons is constantly underway. This site derives its value from recent history to do something very specific that the traditional heritage of the archived past just cannot do: raise awareness about an environmental hazard and therefore save lives. Because there's a message attached to this type of sites, which is beware of this thing that may happen again. It also demonstrates the ways in which heritage value may grow over time, challenging an emphasis on the idea that heritage has already been made heritage prior to a catastrophe, and all we have to do is just rewind back to the way that it looked like before. The tsunami boat was not an isolated incident in Aceh, and even in the region, there are boats preserved all across the coast of the Indian Ocean. A second boat, this one even more impressive, sits 4 kilometers inland from the port of the city, and it became a sizable tourist destination and a site of remembrance. These sites, together with mass graves, memorials, and T-shirts you can buy that say, Aceh never dies, with flames. We could have timed that a bit better. Speaks instead of the importance of constructing resilience now, of not interfering with heritage resources that emerge to be in conversation with destruction in sustainable and life-saving ways, and of not erasing recent histories of destruction and reconstruction through preservation agendas that remain strictly loyal to a historical archive. The support of a contemporary counter-archive for heritage value that is situated in the present is met with significant resistance in my work, and I'm assuming some of you can relate to this. We could say that heritage of the contemporary has always had an uneasy relationship with preservation, but not because it's particularly less appealing visually or scientifically than the heritage of a deeper historical period. It may be valued all the same. The heritage of more contemporary times stands out because it highlights that heritage value is always in flux, a moving target for the work of preservation that is hard to accommodate within existing standards and principles. When something is heritage, it simply is, regardless of when it became. It does not stop being heritage, right? I mean, something that we can think about is the way that things become World Heritage Sites. So there's a year in which they become, and then it's assumed that they will always be heritage sites. It's not a reassessment of when this continues to earn its badge to join that particular heritage assemblage. Countries with a more recent growth of heritage industries fall victim to this very rigid framework and are often excluded from heritage conversations, something that makes the study of heritage and preservation in post-colonial states so significant in our field. Countries with a more recent process of heritage making may have no heritage archive to lean on in the creation of contemporary assemblages and the practices of preservation that come alongside it, and may be candidates for relying on a more contemporary or social archive. My research into the rise of a heritage preservation tradition in the state of Qatar is a prototypical example of this context. Now, there are so many things that are often said to describe Qatar that help us understand how it will be approached as a heritage subject. People say it's a small nation on the Arabian Gulf, that it's a new nation on account of becoming a sovereign state only in 1971, and definitely a rapidly developing nation. And these are all kind of indicators that the heritage conversation is going to be problematic. So I want to contrast this photograph entitled Emergency Landing Ground on Qatar at the top. I hope you can see how sparsely populated it is. And with somehow a somewhat contemporary picture of downtown Doha today, which has already changed significantly since this photograph. Development as a result of natural gas and oil revenues creates modernizing conditions that are fast-paced and probably unmatched outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And this change advances on the built landscape at a rate that far outruns the development of local heritage preservation concerns and approaches. So like the development of approaches don't really have a lot of time to figure out what they want to do. So this approach basically begins to develop in the 1970s when the state frames and fixes the cultural identity that is already set in place. And so it gets this identity and rebrands it as heritage. This is a process that often happens in much earlier historical periods in other regions of the world. Over time, the influx of immigrants that was needed to support this rapidly growing economy has led to a heightened concern with the preservation of an authentic way of life. So even though this process was already in motion, the type of demographic that Qatar features in terms of expertise has also caused particular pressures to accelerate and define more clearly exactly what is a local approach and what's local heritage. In this sense, heritage preservation discussions across Qatar are not necessarily attached to traditional concerns with the loss of value of places and things. So most of the concern revolves around something else. Today, searching for fragments of a heritage archive lead us to this type of landscape if we are looking for what we think looks like a heritage archive. Abandoned villages dating to the 1950s and later, which is a historical period that remains suspended in place waiting to be valued. So its ruination at the moment is not just that we didn't get around to it yet, it's waiting, I would say. I know that's the technical term is waiting. This is the type of landscape that had one of my colleagues explain to me the minute I landed in Qatar that, listen, there is no heritage in Qatar. And the reason why she made this judgment that's coming from a very Western-oriented perspective is a combination of the fact that a lot of the material we see is associated with a very recent history in European timeline terms. And also that you look at something like this and you don't see an obvious concern for preservation, right? We look at ruins and we think, well, something kind of went wrong. It's not even being signposted, etc. in the Western sense. The complexity of examining heritage in Qatar can be summarized best right now with a little kind of case study vignette that I'll bring to you. In 2013, the historic Al-Asmaq house in downtown, at the center of Qatar, was found half demolished by a bulldozer. I keep turning around because I changed the slides at the last minute, so I want to make sure it's, sorry. The neighborhood was already in a derelict state at this time, standing in sharp contrast to its adjacent redevelopment project, an ultra-modern, luxurious, and sustainable downtown complex called Misheleb, downtown Doha, which was actively replacing an older neighborhood just like this one. The Qatari population had long abandoned the neighborhood in favor of more prestigious neighborhoods and larger houses in the outer rings of the city. The community of heritage experts in Qatar was outraged by this particular event. Despite its apparent abandonment, Al-Asmaq remained inhabited by migrant workers from various nationalities who continued to run small businesses, send their children to school, and maintain these rented homes as best as they could. This particular building had been earmarked for conservation, as this sector of the city contains much of the remaining specimens of traditional courtyard architecture in Doha. The demolition marked the beginning of the end. Soon the neighborhood was deserted and more demolition followed, and is in the process of being somewhat redeveloped with some heritage flavor, including this structure somehow. Most people living in Qatar would have not heard of being concerned by this incident, including many Qatari citizens and foreigners that have come across, who circulate mostly in other parts of the city. This is in large part due to the complex history and contemporary nature of urban environment in Qatar. Al-Asmaq stands as evidence of the process of abandonment, reuse, and controlled use by migrant communities. The survival of historic structures through their use value, not necessarily through a heritage value. It's just practical to use them. And this way they get preserved through continuous use. But around the time of demolition, a small but growing number of foreign heritage professionals began to teach cultural heritage and collections management to students who would soon become influential members and leaders and participants in the growing culture of preservation that was gaining momentum across the Arabian Peninsula at this time. Cultural heritage preservation institutions had also grown significantly by then, so it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. We were training students, but also institutions were becoming more solidified. So there was a definite heritage discourse happening at this time. That means that Qatari citizens, either pursuing a graduate degree or being involved in this type of work, were exposed to this, but also initiatives such as the Mapping Old Doha project, which aimed to document those neighborhoods around the very site of demolition that I just shown you. And this was aimed at building an archive, right? Like an archive of historical resources that didn't exist before for the whole country, essentially. An exposure to a discourse about caring for the past, when juxtaposed with the experiences of the state of disrepair and the contemporary use of historic neighborhoods, understandably resulted in some conflict in my classroom, other classrooms, and beyond. So you're just kind of getting these two different messages about what's happening. This sums up one of the main challenges of identifying, or I would say creating, a public or a stakeholder to authorize the heritage archive that is taking shape in a place, right? Because that's what we do. We just reach out and we look for not just the expert opinion, but like the public that sustains the expert opinion. It would be quite different if we did this 100 years ago, but this is just how we do things now. This would-be public is torn, understandably. On the one hand, the construction of heritage is underway in line with a historical archive and its accompanying political agenda. So we do get some kind of restoration work happening of very select sites. But on the other hand, historic structures are disassembled and displaced, yet continue to inspire new architectural languages that are created to counter the scarcity of Qatar's unique heritage. So there's things being saved for later, there's things being reconstructed, there's things being just demolished and they just never come back, right? So there's kind of multiple messages being sent out to the public. So the idea that one can simply ask the public in the absence of a kind of locally built historical archive is therefore an oversimplified approach in this context. So on an anecdotal note, because I know this will come up in the Q&A, if you do interviews about the significance of heritage, you get data saturation after 3 interviews. So you get the same response about things. So this is why I'm focused on observing and studying practices more than asking very kind of bound questions. And now I'm going to take you to a completely different case study because I have no idea how much time has gone by. Rodney, you're watching. Okay, good. Okay, to move to a completely different part of the world, right, and leave you suspended with this concern about the public. I'll come back to that. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Austrian physicist Ronald Richter was invited to present a plan for research and development of nuclear fusion directly to Argentina's President Perón. I don't know why I said it in English. Perón is the right pronunciation. I'm going to do this for the whole talk. Richter offered a potentially unlimited power source, and this was matched with potentially unlimited resources from the House of the President. His labs were eventually built on the island of Huemul. Wow. Just trust me, there's an island there. It's in Patagonia, the northern side of the Patagonian region on the border with Chile. It's a national park. So it's encroached by a national park. It's accessible from a nearby town, and with a newly opened airport at the time, this place allowed Richter to operate in conditions of extreme secrecy and to exclude civilian access. Hence, the island. Construction of a large-scale atomic research facility began in July 1949. This was carried out in conditions of extreme secrecy. But ironically, this project was also very visible. Its completion required large amounts of material to be shipped into the small town of Bariloche and across the Lake Nahuelhuapi, as well as the collaboration of local army posts that supplied the workers. So it was invisible, but it was also extremely visible. Overall, documentary sources relating to the building works are relatively few. I think I have a picture. Oh yeah, so I don't know if you can, this is like the barges that are crossing the lake in order to carry the material in trucks. And this is just kind of some of the activity on the site. Construction involved massive impact on the landscape of the island and the construction of infrastructure on the coasts of the lake to sustain this project as well. The structures built on the Huemul Island included 4 enormous laboratories that were at the center of the promises made by Richter to deliver this scientific breakthrough. These included 2 small experiment reactors, a battery to power the laboratories, a house, an office for Richter, and storage facilities. While construction of the Huemul installations have been described in some fragmentary detail, even less is known about the rapid and relatively sudden process of abandonment and decommissioning of the installations when the facilities were shut down, because it was so secretive. By April 1950, Perón and his wife Evita visited the site to find a monumental wooden framework standing 12 meters tall and 12 meters in diameter, ready to accommodate the concrete walls of a main nuclear reactor, as he claimed. Later on, this reactor would be set into bedrock instead for a different configuration, and much later on, it would just be built above ground again. Sorry for that. Be built above ground again in a much bigger configuration. Meanwhile, active experimentation kept the construction of the site moving forward until, on February of 1951, Richter announced that he had successfully demonstrated nuclear fusion. By March, the president held a press conference where he announced that thermonuclear experiments were carried out under conditions of control on a technical scale, whatever that means. Pressure from the few nuclear physicist experts in Argentina who were critical of Richter's work made Perón launch an investigation. The team he appointed was shown a series of highly orchestrated demonstrations in September of 1952. The report concluded that there was no serious scientific content to these claims, and by November 1953, a military team occupied the island and allegedly found many of the instruments were not even connected. The experiments were then pronounced fraudulent. The laboratories were closed, where many of the instruments were relocated just across the mainland, where Jose Balseiro, who had authored the review of the project, headed a new nuclear physics research institute in 1955. So the period of occupation is actually quite short, but the impact on the landscape is huge. The island across the lake from the current institute that's operating today remained in military custody until the 1970s, at which point its management appears to have been passed on to the National Park Service, we think, and subsequently to the municipality of the city of Bariloche that's been thriving since. It occasionally resurfaces as a potential heritage tourism destination since the early 1990s, but overall remains abandoned. Oh, okay, so these are the experts. Look how they're experting. Right, this is such a great photo. And the island remains abandoned. So this is a view of kind of the town and the ski resort in the background, in the town of Bariloche, and the ruins, these mysterious ruins in the island, from the little hill of the island. Studying the life history of this site pushes the limits of every possible archive. The black and white photos that you just saw, and the reason why I was going through photos so quickly is because these are all the historic photos we ever found for the site. And we're looking for, I know, Rodney, stop playing Candy Crush. We've looked for years. We turned every stone with this guy, right? And there's 6 photos, right? Like everywhere, all the secret files in the US, in Germany, in Argentina, nothing. This is all we have. The island itself remains invisible in the master plan of the city, and to some extent also in the history of Bariloche and of the National Commission for Atomic Energy as part of its story of origins. It's actually not mentioned. With only marginal information published about the site, and most documents burned by military authorities, we are left with processes of discursive appearance and disappearance off situ, both through objects that ended up elsewhere, as well in the popular imagination in a variety of mediums and locations. So in principle, the possibilities of building an archive are so rich just because this place ricocheted in so many directions, in principle. So for example, in and around the laboratories and offices of the current atomic center lie the remains of some dated instrumentation that was once imported as top of the line and sometimes even smuggled, which is very exciting bits of stories that we've managed to capture. In the city of Bariloche, the social fabric of a certain generation of what was then a very small town, as well as the actual fabric of the city, so some actual structures and monuments, were built using material traces of the project, either by reclaiming bricks or by stealing bricks that were coming in on the trains at night. Since it was also secretive, the stealing of the bricks was also quite secretive, so nobody was being stopped. Locals of a certain generation experienced the project from the shores, so to speak. The cargo trains arriving at the station at night, the constant stream of trucks bringing materials to the island, the view of powerful reflector lights that you could see from the coast, the noise of machinery and the sound of explosions that shattered windows that one day. And these are common narratives, but they need some prying to come out because the project is still shrouded in a mashup of shame and politics. So it's quite difficult to have people talk about this. You would think it's like an incredibly traumatizing event, but it's a scientifically traumatizing event. I don't know. I didn't coin that. It doesn't exist. Marking the extent of tangible and narrative debris across the landscape, the traces of the Womul project, as Ingalls says, deterritorialize the Womul atomic project. We can consider these traces and peripheries as a way to reascribe a multifaceted, multi-temporal, multiplayer narrative of a project that will likely never be resolved by use of any one particular archive. So it's one of these impossible case studies that we can't seem to stop being interested in. So to conclude, I want to sum up 3 issues in heritage methodologies that I learned from my work and their ability to access and contribute to different archives that I'm hoping can guide some further questions in our remaining time together. The first is the temporal promiscuity of using heritage as a category that is 1, temporally bound, 2, constantly in flux, 3, it can also travel back and forth in time. A sort of constant that connects different experiences and archives. But is it a constant though? So I was trying to figure out how to explain this to my students, and hopefully it will work better with you. If I ask my parents born in the 1950s to tell me their experiences about the Anthropocene, a category that was much more recently made popular and properly defined, I first have to explain to them what the Anthropocene is, and then I have to ask them to take this construct into their own past and rebuild their memories around this construct I've just given them, and then relay it back to me in the construct that I've basically forced them to use, right? So it feels a little bit like memory engineering sometimes when we use the term heritage to interrogate different forms of archive, because we have to do this prior categorical work. And likewise, anyone who has had to use a translation of the word heritage into another language to examine historical or contemporary resources and then deduce from that heritage value knows exactly what I'm talking about. It feels like uncomfortable leapfrogging because you're using this category that's kind of been invented in a particular place at a particular time. The second point I want to make is that we need to realize that the trajectory in heritage and preservation studies has been significantly guided by the possibility of gaining the support of a public that legitimizes the heritage archive that is being constructed. Calls for participatory models in heritage preservation have shown some awareness that not everyone has access and the ability that is required to partake in heritage practices and decisions, least of all to shape them, right? So we may think about giving access, but shaping that construct is a bit more difficult. But still, the public is mythologized through the lens of the stakeholder, even under conditions where public coalescence is not really achievable. I'm thinking in particular for people working in totalitarian states or any kind of non-democratic context. It's actually quite difficult to think about participation in the way that our textbooks and fancy edited volumes are suggesting. And thirdly, the near complete disappearance of the archive. What do we do with that, right, in relation to my third case study? It's what happens when a field of study that we've defined as a contemporary product shaped from history encounters no ability to interrogate that history, right, through empirical means, right? And it becomes extremely fragmentary. Now, it would be a cliche to stand here and say to you guys, heritage studies is in crisis. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I would say that we are facing a really great opportunity to chart the way forward. To me, the issue is no longer that we are bombarded by new forms of heritage left and right and we can't keep up. The way I see it's not a moving target anymore, right, as actually the assemblage and possibilities of what heritage may be. We already know it's quite infinite. But it feels that more work needs to go into the epistemology that informs methodological choices, or else the field will continue to perpetuate old paradigms, stale archival interpretations, and problematic forms of expertise. So as a final word, I want to say, teach your students about methods epistemologically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots of things there to discuss. Do we have any questions?
Wendy.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought. My question is actually really similar to what I was thinking in relation to Heba's talk, which is that I think part of the production of heritage is in order to create a proxy for inclusion in which the state becomes the invisible actor. And so especially what you were saying at the end about this fiction of inclusion, I would say it's not only for authoritarian states, it's about producing a fiction of democratic inclusion where the public is already spoken for, so the public sort of becomes a subaltern. Also, the amount of power that's invested in making some things appear and some things disappear.
Yeah.
So my question would be, given that we have a model of preservation which supports hegemonic power by making those hegemonic interests invisible, how can one produce a type of, I'm not going to say preservation because of my own work, but a type of valorization which includes participation without having the state as the proxy for the public?
Yeah, the state or the expert, which is a proxy for the state, right? Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I don't know if I can resolve this, but I want to take a point home and say that the construction of the stakeholder as this kind of salvation moment in heritage studies where, and now we can do consultation, has actually not come accompanied by the methodological rigor that you would think needed to come to the table, right, to be brought to the table in order to actually operationalize the idea of the stakeholder, because it continues to be a category that is manufactured by the top expert. So that power dynamic has never been disrupted. It's just being shrouded in fancy words that someone learned in an MBA, or I don't know where it came from. But once I tried to write a history of the stakeholder as a concept, and I couldn't actually historicize it very well, which could speak about my poor research skills with the archive, right? Because I don't do archives, but I do now. But but yeah, I agree with you. And the problem of disarming the stakeholder as a concept, as an analytical concept that serves a purpose, is that I've never figured out, other than doing in-depth ethnography, which is a lot to ask of a lot of fields that are not coming out of anthropology. I haven't figured out a way of doing, like the National Park Service had this thing called rapid ethnographic study, which was supposed to build categories in situ. But the rapid thing made me cringe a little bit, because I'm trained in a field where we think we have to do this kind of deep shadow familiarization with the culture that we're studying. So sometimes it feels like the only option is to just stop being in the driver's seat altogether, and not everyone trained in heritage can do that, because the field coming out of a genealogy of conservation relies heavily on this connoisseur type of expert. From whatever field is coming from, there's always the expert. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are trying to disarm the hegemony of the expert, and often being asked to have an opinion about something, and then you're really torn, right? Like, well, what give us a solution? And so you come across as this useless academic that's just deconstructing things left and right and never offering something to fill the void in. So I'm going to personally stand by my ethnographic skills, and I don't, personally, the work that I do is always ethnographically embedded. So I like to say I don't put a word in writing until I've done 5 years of field work, which is a huge privilege, right? Because sometimes things need to be, happen faster. But when I lived in California during my PhD, there was a heritage organization that asked me, how can we do things better? And I said, why don't you start reading existing ethnographic work that gives you actually different temporal windows into construction of value without actually ever using the word heritage. It still feels like leapfrogging, but at least it feels embedded. So here's my soapbox speech about ethnography and how great it is. But again, resources, right? Like, who has time to suspend everything or write a research proposal that allows you several years of intimate engagement with a field site, language learning, etc. Sorry, this is not, I wanted to end on a more hopeful thing, but keep doing what you're doing. As an art historian, I'll keep doing what I'm doing as an anthropologist. Sorry. Anyone else wants to take me down a tangent? Go on.
Negative forms of evidence. So a lot of the examples you were talking about were about, you kind of raised the issue of the absence of documentation of certain kind of phenomena or issues that revolve around the individual cases that you're discussing. And some of the difficulties that you face, you've faced in finding the complete absence of certain forms of evidence in the archive about certain kinds of things. So the kind of example of one more at the end that you were discussing, where particularly there were, it was very difficult to find information about what went on in the place, precisely who was there, what resources were being mobilised, even though it was this sort of massive state project, precisely because it was secret. And I mean, this isn't just a sort of throwaway comment. You obviously looked very hard, and then we had
Esther
here.
where are you?
9 months
Yeah.
looking very hard at archival sources and still turning up essentially very little on this project. But so this is, this is actually a genuine question. One normally asks a question that one has an inkling of the answer of, but I have no answer to this. But it's actually a genuine question. How does one engage methodologically with absences and negative forms of heritage? And
Yeah.
you see that, obviously there's something in all the papers today which is partially about identifying an absence and then trying to find some trace of something that allows you to sort of find something of that thing that one identifies as missing. But and maybe this is a meta question that helps wrap together some threads from the conference in a way. But that is about the kind of real possibilities for engaging absences as forms of evidence.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the issue of dealing with so many types of projects that I'm attracted to, which have to do with these massive gaps in information, is that at the end, part of it is our fault. So it's about the skills we've developed, and others are just that there's nothing there. And the question is, when do you stop looking, right? Because that's been a question that we've grappled in, and I've grappled in all my research. And I think the temporal limitations of fieldwork are set by your time and resources again, right? And this is true of a lot of research questions, that they're bound by the practicalities of doing the research, of putting yourself through the research. But I've been in some weird conversations with more senior scholars that have kind of sat there and argued. I like how we're all doing therapy up here on the podium, that have told me, well, you didn't look hard enough, or you're not a good enough ethnographer, or your Khaliji Arabic is terrible, so you can't access this particular conversation that I've never heard of but must exist, right? This obsession with the idea that with the right level of skill, you can access this information. It makes our field look so crazy and so extractive, right? Some things are just not going to be found, either because they're behind certain rules of privacy, because literally every archive has been burned, like burned. We know it's been burned. So, so it's hard to hit that right note between having the humility that we think we're bringing to the table in critical heritage studies and recognize that we have limits, but also argue that, no, I've looked everywhere and I did my job right? And building some confidence in our methods. Does that make some kind of sense? Yes, hey, Mirjam.
I think just building on from that, I would as well sort of tack onto that question another one, which is, I think a lot about how in the wake of sort of the subaltern turn and deconstructivist turn in archives, we're sort of left with this almost optimism when we encounter an absence in the archive, and we're explaining,
Yeah.
We can recover marginal perspectives if only we can read along against the grain effectively enough or find the right counter archive.
Right.
There are voices absent from an archive. We can still get at it via other means because we have all of these tools at our disposal. And so that absence itself becomes almost a fetish if you look at it through that
Yeah.
lens. And I wonder if that's a thought that sort of paradoxically can be turned into something productive.
Right, so yeah, you're right, like what Rodney's saying, right? How can we make this kind of empty space be the thing that you're studying as an empty space without this obsession to fill it with stuff, right? And then not filling it with, I don't know, guesswork, or like how do we remain empirical and convincing as a field, right? While leaving the holes kind of untouched and studying the contours of the whole. That's the problem. Thank you for summarizing my talk. But better, we're doing it better. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, since you think so much about what an expert is and what kind of expertise counts as expertise, I wondered how if you thought about different forms of making that knowledge that you gained available to a broader public. Because academic publishing is also what makes us, or turns us into an expert. And in one specific field. And so what other forms of actually spreading the knowledge and the research you do have you thought about?
Yeah, I think that's a very personal choice at the end of the day. I think what Rachel was saying yesterday, we try to define the type of scholars that we want to be and that we can be within our ability to maintain our jobs. We know how academia works and the type of publications that are expected in different circles, right? So in the US, academic peer-reviewed publications allow us to keep our jobs up to a certain point. So that's not great. And then you kind of feel you're selling your soul to that process. But I think we did an exhibition for WIMUL, right, open to the scientific community. So we actually held the exhibition about it was interesting because it wasn't an exhibition about results, right, because we have so little. It was an exhibition about the process through which we're hitting dead ends in the project without actually leading to any kind of simplified conclusions. So that really worked out because the funding that we had forced us to do it. No. But then I actually, as I'm working on my book on Qatar, I'm getting a lot of my interlocutors, whatever word we use is always horrible, stakeholders, involved a lot in my writing. So a lot of people don't actually want to co-author because they can't actually put their names on things, but I'm getting every one of my chapters read and commented aggressively, for example, by the people that I've been working with, right? As a kind of sort of collaborative experience. I didn't do that for my Indonesia work, but I was thinking, you know, how can I co-produce the knowledge a little bit more? Because it always feels you're co-producing it anyways through sound bites of like a much broader and rich experience. So I'm trying to get to do that, for example. And I don't know if you were thinking of more like specific media to invest our work in.
Well, since we talked about the absence of voices,
Yeah.
audible voices, do you collect an archive, for example, of interviews to make them available?
Well, so in the US, I think the UK is moving in the same direction. We can't actually open our archive of interviews, right? Because we have to follow IRB protocols of human subjects regulations, so nobody but me can see my interviews. And this is something that we can discuss more, that was actually meant to protect our subjects of study. And perhaps we should push back in some capacity so that we can allow the subject of study to be more visible. But then, you know, it just becomes data almost, right? I don't know if anyone here has used IRB protocols, but you have to anonymize names so people lose their identity. Often you have to anonymize them to the extent that you have to remove their job title and position as well. So then it's like this horrible, like, a Qatari, you know, and then somehow that tells the story. And it's part of the ethnographic tradition in many ways. I don't know. I'm still kind of experimenting, as it's my second volume, on how I'm going to tell the story of the human landscape that we've been concerned about, right? How do we populate, how do we humanize each one of these vignettes while simultaneously protecting the, you know, the personal details and this, ensuring the safety, the social and political safety of our interviewees. So that is not a possibility right now, unless we come up with a way of pushing back and labeling our work as oral history, which actually gets away with a lot, oral history.
Collaborating with artists sometimes seems to be a good route.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I mean, this itself seems to speak to certain kinds of disciplinary anxiety. It's about the nature of the data that they collect. So journalists never think about this stuff.
Yes.
So
Right,
I'm
you
not
take
saying-
care,
I'm
you're
not
right, you
saying
take care to do
journalistic
that.
Standards are necessarily better or
Yeah.
to aspire to for anthropologists, for example, but it says something about the onto-epistemological status of certain kinds of data and its relationship with the production of certain kinds of disciplinary expertise, which I think is interesting in a cross-disciplinary context to kind of think about. Thinking about the ways in which we as researchers interface with particular sorts of conflicts. And then different kind of national traditions. So
But it's really messed up, because if a journalist does an interview to someone and they publish it with names, I can use that with names. But if I did the same interview, I have to anonymize. Yeah. Any more depressing thoughts in our field? Yes, Colin.
I hope it's not depressing. But
Uplift us, please.
I really liked the way you said that the use of heritage is memory engineering in a lot of kind of interviews.
Discursively, yeah.
Which I think is very accurate. And I think there's a lot of archival engineering that I've had to do to think about the history of heritage. Where actually, I just wrote down some words here that I would have said, oh yeah, they're talking about heritage there.
I know, right?
Landmarks, treasures. So we're having to kind of excavate this term that's been loaded onto
Yeah.
us at a certain point to think about.
And excavate with an invented typology, because, yeah.
But what I'm wondering there is then, to what extent does that, understanding that this word heritage contains a lot of other things within it, to what extent does that allow us to get to some kind of question of fundamental processes of inheritance, of transmission? All of these words are also loaded, I know.
Yeah.
But they are processes that heritage kind of contains within it that might allow us to have conversations across different sites, disciplines,
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. I think you all have your own mechanisms for doing this, but Rachel Engman and I just came up with a special issue. I'm going to plug in here. In the journal Material Religion, and we asked each one of it's on Islam and heritage, and we asked each of the contributors that when possible they avoid using the word heritage as a standalone, but use it as an adjective. So heritage value, heritage practices, heritage sensibilities, whatever you want to call it, but not use heritage as a thing, but as a thing that makes things in a certain way. And I've shifted, I can't believe I'm going to say this on camera, I kind of want to burn my first book because I used the word heritage as a heritage thing, even though really if I think about it, that's not how I thought, but it's such a shorthand for the work that we do. But now it becomes a mouthful, but I try to say heritage practices every time I say heritage, or preservation practices, and I've shifted my work it feels very suddenly to the study of practice, because I feel you can actually observe, under the umbrella of a heritage practice, you can cluster more terms, so you can observe care for something. So I think that's probably something different people do in different subfields differently, but that's kind of been the thing through which I've tried to build some rigor in the fact that I'm excavating a term with an uncertain reference collection. So now my reference collection can be, I'm looking at things that I can identify as a practice, which I feel as an anthropologist and an archaeologist, I can see more clearly with less leapfrogging. But again, I mean, I bet you I'm gonna want to change that for the next project.
Okay. Time for just one last quick question.
I wonder if you have encountered any local critical discourse to the main elitist project in Doha, which is the Museum of Islamic Civilization, which, as we know, is full of fakes. So that's a different type of elitist memory engineering. Did you encounter any critical sort of assessment of that sort of practice by the elite in Qatar?
Right, so I very purposely have avoided working in museums in Qatar because everyone else is, right? But it doesn't mean that the question doesn't transfer to the more kind of site and more general practices of heritage overall. And the sad answer is no, I haven't encountered any. And that, I think, has to do, again, maybe with my ability to access that kind of discourse, which would not be openly revealed to me. So it's the kind of thing that I mine for when people do an interview for like Harper's Bazaar or something. Like I try to mine for that kind of piece of resistance of someone, but I think there's the process seems to be happening with a lot of civil society. I hesitate to say something so negative about Qatar because I think they're doing really interesting stuff, but I don't. It is the project for me in my academic trajectory that has made me realize how ridiculous it is to look for the public so simply and as an approachable category, because I can't put any of my interviewees in the position in which they are even anonymizing them, I'd feel really uncomfortable doing them because they hold positions there, and I know what would happen to them. And I think this is true of many societies. It's not unique to Qatar, or I think it happens in democratic states as well, that it's hard to synthesize the resistance position in a way that is believable in an ethnography. Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.
And before we break for lunch, I just have a plug, which I just remembered, which is why I put this big thing on the screen. We're running another conference here, just up the road at the Institute of Education, next summer, the Association of Critical Heritage Studies Futures Conference on the future of heritage studies and the future in heritage. Which resonates with many of the themes today. So if you liked this, have a look at this and see whether you think that there's some scope to participate. It will be a big conference. We've got a kind of film stream, so for those that have been making films, there might be something in here for you. Discussion panels, more conventional paper panels, and our call for our submission portal's just gone live today. And the call for papers is open until mid-October. And we have lots of people in the room that are involved in organising this too. Colin, Sterling, Hannah Morell, Esther Breithoff, Tina Pafitas, anyone else here that's on the local organising? Oh, Johnny Gardner. So lots of familiar faces Yeah, so have a look at this, and we'd love for you to be involved. And for those that are watching on the live stream, we'd also love for you to be involved too. And now we'll go to lunch. So thanks very much. Back here in an hour's time.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to kick off now. So welcome back. My name is Hannah Morell, and I'm a research associate at the Institute of Archaeology, and I'll be chairing the second session of Counter Archives, part one being yesterday with Johnny, Wendy, and Rishika. So there's a little bit of a change with the program, and Mustafa Kemal is going to present. He is a PhD candidate at Koç University in Turkey, and he'll be talking on labor and local communities in the history of archaeology in Turkey.
Welcome back. Thank you all for being here, and also thank you very much for the invitation to be able to speak here. Today, the paper I'm going to present is based on my dissertation project on the history of archaeological practice in Turkey, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. I've been researching the involvement of local communities and the landscape of labor in the archaeological work, as well as the development of Turkish academia in archaeology. This paper also gives me the opportunity to reflect particularly on the methodologies that I employed in my research, the constraints and the, let's say, opportunities that I had regarding my research. I would like to begin my paper by showing these contrasting two images, both from the same place. On July 9th, 2017, the World Heritage Committee announced that Aphrodisias, most known for as a Greco-Roman archaeological site located in southwestern Turkey, was inscribed to the UNESCO World Heritage List. On the World Heritage website, the decision was announced accompanied with a link to a series of pristine photographs of Aphrodisias, just like the one you see on the left. The image of the tetrapylon, the monumental gateway to the temple of Aphrodite, which was reconstructed in the late 1980s as part of an anastylosis project, was the first one to view on the website. Along with others, there were more that captured crystal clear images of all the major monuments and sculptures found in the city. Images that are, these were images that are stripped of people, whether be it archaeologists who work on the site or local communities who used to live and still live around the site. Tetrapylon, this reconstructed monument, then became the thing that most associated with the site. Similar images of the monument has been featured in various media throughout the years, from archaeological literature to popular media, from covers of Turkey's tourism initiatives abroad to even a recent Vodafone ad. The photograph just next to it is taken by Ara Güler, a photojournalist from Istanbul. However, it depicts a very different side of Aphrodisias. It shows two elderly men casually conversing while seated on an ancient remain, possibly a sarcophagus. It also shows on the background houses from Geyre, the village that was built on top of the ancient site of Aphrodisias, until the systematic excavation started in the 1960s by Professor Kenan Erim of New York University. As I said, we don't necessarily see the image of local communities, particularly in archaeological literature, but when we do, it becomes quite unexpected ways. The photo you see is from Kenan Erim's, the director, former director of the site, published in 1986, titled Aphrodisias, City of Venus, Aphrodite. The photo was taken by David L. Brill, and there was no identification of the people or of the kids that are pictured on the photo. The only quote was the one that you see there. 4 young wrestlers briefly recreate a scene that illustrates the chief purpose of the stadium, which was to hold athletic contests contests and events. These would have included running, jumping, discus, and javelin throwing, boxing, and wrestling. It was, of course, the general convention for participating athletes to perform naked. So as part of the, my dissertation project, I interviewed people who, particular scholars who worked on Turkey, carried out archaeological work for a long time in Turkey. And one of those people was Brian Rose, now a professor of archaeology at UPenn. And I quote, when I asked Brian Rose, who worked at the site as a field archaeologist during the 80s, basically at the same time when the photo was taken, regarding the attitudes of the local community towards the archaeological work. And then he elaborated, I quote, I think it was positive. In retrospect, we should have explained to them what we were doing, why it was historically important. We never did that. Kenan never did it. But this was the best job they could get in the area. Even though there was some resentment among some of the workmen because Geyre had been on top of the ancient city of Aphrodisias, Kenan arranged for the city to be moved and people didn't like it. I remember the summer of 1980 when I was digging in the Agora Gate and he said, I want you to extend your trench so that it's almost kissing the house where these people were still living, because there were still 2 or 3 families that were there. And I remember when they had to leave the house, move to modern Geyre, which is just very close to the ancient city of Aphrodisias. The children were crying. The house was demolished. It was sad. So there was some resentment because even though they got some new homes, they had to leave their family homes. So in order to give a voice to local communities who have been involved from the beginning in the archaeological work, I've conducted an extensive archival research in archives and institutions in US, UK, mostly in Germany, and also in Turkey. I should also say that I call them archives, but in reality they are very different from each other in terms of accessibility to a public audience and also in terms of cataloging. I could only find I didn't limit myself to a geographical region and try to find as much as possible in terms of documents that were specifically authored by the local communities instead of reading through excavation diaries and letters who are mentioned in them. So today I'm going to show you a few of them, the documents specifically, as I said, authored by the members of the local community, in order to show not only to give voice instead, which would be instead lost, but also in order to elaborate how I came to see them and came to find them in the first place in terms of explaining more on the archival politics of archaeology archives. The back of the photograph on the slide reads in Turkish, şu cansız hayalim sizlere ölmez bir hatıra olsun, bana baktıkça beni görürsün. The rough translation would be, let this lifeless image of mine be an undying memory for you. By looking at me, you'll see me. So these lines belong to Cemil Dinçer from Polatlı, which is a town near the ancient city of Gordian in central Turkey, and were addressed to Maktad Mennik, a professor of archaeology at Bryn Mawr College. And this was in 1950s. He starts and he sends his photo accompanied by a letter. He starts, he was in the 4th grade at the time he wrote these lines, and also he wrote a letter. He starts the letter by thanking Professor Mennik for her letter and expresses his happiness that she did not forget him. He then talks about his daily routine, his studies, and even expresses his desire to go to US the following year. The photo he includes, he says, is an exchange for a wristwatch he wants from Mennik as a memory or a souvenir from her to be brought from US. The history of archaeological archives, archaeological projects, gives us some clues on how the voices of the local communities can be heard. A clear example, I would say, is the archive that I've came across with this document is the Matadi papers located at the Bryn Mawr College, Pennsylvania, US. The Matadi papers are now organized in under 20 series, which cover the period from the late 1950s, when she was first employed by the college, to the early 2000s, and include a variety of materials such as her notes and writings, correspondence with over 160 names and institutions, diverse bodies of materials from her archaeological fieldwork, mostly in Turkey, organizational and administrative papers, particularly from her directorship of the American Research Institute in Turkey, which was still is based at University of Pennsylvania, and her works sent to her by other scholars. The series number 3, titled Correspondence, has over 150 different folders categorized based on the corresponding person. However, there are also additional folders which are titled based on the time frames only. These include the documents whose authors could not be identified based on the finding aid on the website of the archive. The 1952-1956 folder from the correspondence series contains a bunch of documents sent from the local members of the local communities in Turkey to Professor Menlik. I'm not sure if you can see it on the slide here, unfortunately, but this folder is titled by its chronological date on the online finding aid as 1952 to 1956, but the physical folder, just on at the back, has the tag Turkish letters written on it, just on the side. A recent correspondence from the archivist from Bryn Mawr College on this issue revealed that the archive has gone through several different stages of organizing and classification. Apparently, she passed away, so she didn't left them in very strict order. Different stages of organizing and classification, and in the end, it were the archivists who put this particular group of documents in this folder, not Professor Menlik herself. In this folder, there were some 36 documents, including small passport photos and family portraits, souvenirs, letters, holiday greeting cards, and a few news clippings, all sent from Turkey. On the website for the Menlik papers, there is the following remark, and I quote, "However, this collection does not provide strong insight into archaeological history, nor Professor Menlik's process when approaching archaeological issues," end quote. Contrary to this remark, I argue, the Menlik papers, as well as other collections I will mention, provide a very strong insight into the archaeological history when one looks at the history of archaeology from a wider perspective and defines archaeology in a much more inclusive manner. Another example is, I'll quote, is Asım Erdilek. "In my research so far in the archival materials, as well as oral history interviews, I have not yet come across with an instance where a member of the local community who worked at an excavation earlier on ended up studying archaeology and becoming professional archaeologists. There are, however, several instances of high school students from the local community who went on to higher education to study other subjects who were formally employed by the archaeological projects. The story of Asım Erdilek is a case in point on how his education and later life changed as a result of his work and experience at an archaeological excavation. The folder titled Asım Erdilek, consisting of correspondence and recommendation letters in George Hoffman's personal archive at Widener Library, Harvard University. George Hoffman was the for a long time, the director of Sardis excavation project, which is a site located in Western Turkey. Presents an intriguing dimension of relationship between archaeologists and the local community, particularly how an archaeological project might directly or indirectly touch upon the lives of people around the excavation. In a recommendation letter regarding Erdilek's college application, dated February 14th, 1963, addressed to Professor Donald Donald Flaherty, the foreign student advisor of Dickinson College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Professor Hoffman gives a brief summary of how he came to know Asım Erdilek. Hoffman states that Asım Erdilek worked at the Sardis excavation in the summer of 1962 as a, I quote, trainee archaeologist / translator, a position, end quote, a position he had at the age of 17. Appointed by a joint committee consisting of U.S. Affairs of Cultural Attaché and the Turkish Ministry of National Education, with a special grant from the State Department, U.S. It appears that Erdilek taught Turkish to the members of the archaeological expedition at Sardis, in addition to his other duties, and earned a very favorable impression from the team members. The story is rather long, but long story short, he first comes to US as an exchange student to re-study the senior year in US. And through this time, he keeps in touch with Professor Hoffman, who was a professor of archaeology in Harvard University. In the letter, so after finishing high school, he gets very good grades and wants to apply for college to study as an undergraduate in US. And in that regard, he really wants to go to Harvard. So in this letter, he says, I hope to go to Harvard next year. After visiting Harvard twice, I believe it's the best school I can think of. But of course, to go to Harvard, one has to qualify and be accepted there. If I'm rejected at Harvard, I shall believe I'm not well prepared for Harvard. Another fine school is going to offer me a good education. By the way, he's really struggling to find financial aid at the time, so he really needs a scholarship to be able to stay in US. So what else can I or can anyone else think or do? I always knew I had to know my limits. What can I do or what I cannot? I wish in this very critical area of my personal plans and concerns, I did not say what I did not think. I mean, I wish I did not sound as a mixed up kid because of my weakness in this art to express myself. Unfortunately, Asım Erdilek could not get into Harvard to study as an undergraduate and studied instead at Brandeis University in Boston, where he was a valedictorian of his class. He later completed his graduate studies at Harvard, where he got his master's and PhD degrees in economics. He taught at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio for almost 40 years until his retirement in 2010. His eulogy mentions that he grew up in a small farm in Western Anatolia, and his parents had virtually no formal education. The letter mentioned just now, I believe, demonstrates how archaeological work might touch the lives of others around an excavation site in quite mysterious ways. To conclude, I would like to go quickly to the fieldwork that I recently did in the ancient city of Miletus and around the villages. So the photo you might be familiar with as the Miletus Market Gate, which is now a reconstruction of it, is in the Pergamon Museum. And on the other side is a photo taken in the early 1905 or 1906, while the German team there was excavating. So basically my archival work led me to did not really give me what I hope I would find in terms of the activities and the involvement of local communities in archaeological work. It only gave me very limited information and very scattered in terms of chronology as well as geography. So while I was also continuing doing oral history interviews, but basically mostly with archaeology professors in Turkey, from US, UK, who all work in Turkey. So I wanted to take this one basically step further and wanted to interview of members of the local community, particularly focus on the site of Miletus. I realized when I was doing this interviews at the two villages that my own formalized way of conducting oral history, which went through ethic committee and so on and so forth, did not particularly work out in the field when I met members of the local community in the villages, sometimes all at once at the same time. In one instant, I arrived at the local cafe of the village, which is the sort of a common feature in all Turkish villages, where men of the village gather along. I met a Korean War veteran, because Turkey sent troops to the Korean War, who before going to the war worked actually at the excavation. So I went there with the director and the assistant director of the excavation, so I was going there with a very, I wouldn't say formalized, but sort of as a group of people. And the information I got several diverse information regarding the involvement of the local communities in the excavation, and also regarding the social history of those two villages that are in close proximity to the site. However, for example, in terms of formality of my dissertation research, I was not able to record them to be used and deposited in the library as it was agreed before. So that's let me think in more creative ways of, from now on, sort of exploring more creative ways of involvement in the local community in terms of doing the oral history or collaborative ways of writing history. So touching the discussion that we had yesterday in terms of what I considered counter-archives in my particular work, I think it's in three ways. First would be the different understandings of different readings of existing archives and pushing forward those repositories and archives in different ways, that finding documents that you would not necessarily find. Second, creating an archive of his own through oral history interviews, particularly not necessarily in this case with local community members, but the social life of an excavation with archaeologists who worked long time on the site, but who won't share those stories in their archaeological literature. And lastly, as I just mentioned, exploring somehow collaborative ways of writing history with the local community and somehow integrating that history on the site so that it would potentially bring them closer. Thank you. I don't know how to close this.
So our next speaker is Kate Hill, who's the principal lecturer of history in University of Lincoln, who's going to be talking about bodies, emotions, and living with objects at the Highland Folk Museum.
Hello, and thank you for still being here. And if you're fading, I've got lots of pictures. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, so the archive, which I'd like to explore with you today, is not, at least ostensibly, and I come back to this, shaped by colonial legacies. It is, however, an archive which strongly relates to unspoken emotions and bodies, as the call for paper had it, particularly the unspoken pleasures of heritage, which I think are worth thinking about their historical constitution. It's an archive, and it represents a museum which epitomizes non-official and to an extent non-authorized approaches to the past. It is the archive of the Highland Folk Museum in Scotland. This is from about the 1940s, I think, this publicity material. It was the creation of Dr. Isabel Elsie Grant, very long-lived, as you can see there. This is about 1936. She was awarded her doctorate for sort of honorary doctorate in the 1950s by Edinburgh University after she had set up the Folk Museum. So she's not a doctor when she starts doing this. She's not got a doctorate, and that's one of the reasons why she's a bit unofficial. And it arose from her very ad hoc collecting in the Highlands of Scotland in the interwar period, really from 1930s onward. So the first museum opened in 1936 on the island of Iona, in a disused chapel off of northwest Scotland. Possibly the most beautiful museum setting ever. You might disagree, but I think it's quite spectacular, isn't it? It was horrible inside, though. It was very damp and unsuitable and small. And it moved to the mainland of Scotland just before the Second World War. In fact, Iona was closed from the start of the Second World War, and she just got her museum out, or she wouldn't have been able to go to it for 6 years. So she moved it to the Highlands proper of Scotland, and there she had a bit more space, and she was able to expand into open-air museum display with 3 cottages, which I'm going to talk about more as the talk goes on. It was it's the Highland Folk Museum. It was also known as Amphasga, a Gaelic term meaning the shelter, and I think that's a very significant kind of, rescue phrase there. It was entirely an independent museum. It was run from her own resources, which she tended to play down, but she did have enough money to buy buildings, and she charged an entrance fee, but it was very small. And this is one of the reasons why in the 1950s, as she was approaching 70, she gave the museum to a consortium of 4 Scottish universities. She wanted a more permanent footing for it. She wanted to retire. But up to that point, it was just her doing what she wanted to do with her museum. When they took it over, they took a very different approach, and they disparaged her amateurishness. Which is indisputable, her amateurishness, but it is important to note that it's not necessarily a deficit quality. It wasn't that she didn't know how to be more professional, it's that she explicitly decided to do this in a particular non-professional way. She wanted what she described as a homely feel to the museum. And this is partly because she was very keen that the museum should be recognised as a labour of love. Not something paid for, not something that she took her salary from or anything like that. Any sort of paid professional work, I think, downgraded that kind of labour of love in her eyes. So the archive of the museum, or her archive, it's a bit hard to tell which it is, has relatively little of what one would expect from museum records, although that does raise the question of how unexpected are museum records anyway, which I will come back to. So there's a lot of things not there that you might expect. There's not much in the way of annual reports or acquisition records or any of the kinds of standardised things you see at a lot of museums. There are some relatively normal things, for example, of course. This is a typewritten catalogue on the that side, dating from after the grant period, but probably an updating of some sort of earlier version, maybe an index card version. It's certainly her numbers. There are some accounts, as you can just see at the top there, so some of that kind of stuff. But there's actually a lot of other stuff which is much more interesting and quite unexpected. So there's a lot of interpretive material from her own displays. You can't see this very well, but this is something that was actually hanging on the wall. You can just about see the loop at the top. Vegetable dyes example shown, so it's a handwritten list of the sorts of vegetable material you would use to produce different colours. Here are some handwritten labels covering mostly costume, and the handwriting is a deliberate choice. We know that from some correspondence she had. Some more here. This is not a label, this is an example of personal names given to guns in the Highlands, and these are again largely costume labels. And much of this material is also, you turn it over and you've got things like that on the back. So this is obviously watercolours that she had. So the cardboard is material that she'd already used for watercolours in her kind of parallel former life as a quite well-to-do cosmopolitan lady. So there's a lot of Italian and Egyptian scenes on the back of some of the labels. So there's all of that. There's also a number of photograph albums, which I think are very interesting in terms of the content, but also the form in which the material is kept. And if we look at these, you can see that the captions are again handwritten. The photograph albums are very generic photograph albums, personal photograph albums. And the content, again, blurs personal photographs with professional photographs or work photographs. This is Elsie Grant here. This person is her housekeeper. And the housekeeper appears in a lot of the photographs, as we will see. Her name was Mrs. Grant, but she was no relation. And she's clearly playing quite an interesting role in the development of the museum in some ways. But the most interesting of the photographs, there's a whole series where costumes in the collection are being modelled. And it gets even more interesting than this, because then we move on to scenes being staged in the cottages at the museum once it had moved to the Central Highlands. I don't know if you can see this very clearly. This is, I think this is Mr. Grant, the housekeeper's husband, and this is Mrs. Grant, and this is seen in cottage, cobbling boot and knitting, Lachlan Grant, M. Grant, arranged by Mrs. Grant, so arranged by the housekeeper. This is I think it's just a scene. The girls are named Sally Chase, Lachlan Grant, Mrs. Grant, Mary Dean. So the children are no relation there, arranged again by Mrs. Grant. And I think I've got one more. Bath time. That's an unexpected one, isn't it? This is Mrs. Grant, and it's the same two girls there, I think. So these are there's more than these. I'm just showing you some of the easiest to see. It's impossible to know what these photographs are for or how they're used. I mean, we know some of the things that wasn't happening with them that you might... they're clearly not on display for visitors to see, because they do include sort of nighttime scenes and things like that. The museum wasn't open very much. It was only open in the summer and quite restricted hours. There's no evidence that they're part of the interpretive scheme in the museum, because there's no larger reproductions of them, as there are of some of the other photographs, which were then obviously used in the display. And there's also no evidence of them being used as illustrations in any of Grant's publications on Scottish history and folklore, of which there were quite a few. And that's kind of what I was expecting they might be, because we do see constructed scenes used in social history publications in the interwar period quite a bit, but this doesn't seem to be happening here. So we don't know anything about what they were used for, except that maybe they weren't used. Maybe this was just something they did in the cottages and took pictures of it. In terms of if we want to think about it, the archive as an archive, there's a cache of letters not at the museum between Grant and a woman called Louis Russ, who was a long-time friend and collaborator. And because Russ kept the correspondence, it's actually in Glasgow, that correspondence. And this is very much the correspondence of friends who are united by their interest and love of Highland folklore, rather than a professional correspondence. It went on for many, many years. As I say, Grant lived until she was in her 90s, and it goes nearly that far, and has a lot to say about their love of Highland traditions. And we've also got Grant's own memoirs, The Making of Anfasga, which is a brilliant read, soaked in emotion, opinion, subjectivity, with the odd chunk of Scottish economic history sort of dropped in there in a clunky fashion. So I think this archive shows the Highland Folk Museum to have been marked by what was at the time a highly distinctive set of material practices in relation to preservation. Interestingly, even around what preservation actually was. And she had a very strong interest, as you can maybe already see, in intangible heritage. But it's very heavily intertwined with her passion for tangible heritage. She's interested in skills, knowledge, practices, but she's also fixated on stuff. She wrote in her memoir that she was very heavily influenced by Skansen, the Swedish open-air museum in Stockholm, opened around 1890, which she went to when she was quite young, and it had made a very big impression on her. But she did things very differently here. So the cottages in Skansen, it's all about moving buildings from around Sweden, taking them down, moving them, re-erecting them in one place. What she did in the Highland Folk Museum was actually new builds, partly because these are not timber frame buildings, so they're harder to move, but also because she said that's not the spirit of it. They're only ever temporary buildings. It's about getting genuine craftsmen and genuine materials and getting them to build new builds that embody that kind of making tradition, if you like. So these are one of the cottages going up, and here are all three of them as they were the finished product. That one's still there. I think that is the Lewis cottage, but you can't go into it anymore, sadly. So objects are then valued for their ability to be put into use, either furnishing cottages, because once she's got the cottages, she fits out the interior and you can go and visit them there, or to illustrate processes. And she did a lot of processes. You saw her spinning earlier, but she also tried to illustrate processes. You can just about, this is from the very first one on Iona, where she didn't have a kind of open air approach. You can see the bits of wool hanging on the display there, which I think are the dyeing, the examples of dyeing using different plants. A very important part of the display was the animals, kept to show traditional husbandry practices, and you've got some geese here, but it went beyond that. They had some Highland cattle, of course. They also had these Surrey sheep. This is, of course, Mrs. Grant, the housekeeper, again. So this housekeeping job goes well beyond a traditional housekeeping job. These are the lambs, and you can just about see Elsie Grant herself up there with the sheep and the lambs. So they've got a lot of animals here. And what this does, I think, is it starts to blur the line between showing and doing. This is not representation. They actually have to look after these animals all year round, even though, as I say, the museum's opening hours are quite limited. They still need feeding, milking, shearing, all of these kind of things. And what this tends to emphasise, I think, is the way in which the museum is conceptualised by Grant and her housekeeper, Grant, and others around them as a labour of love. They lavish care and emotional investment, not only on livestock, but also on the objects and the museum as a thing, a pseudo-person. Grant says in her memoirs at one point that the museum's definite personality had already asserted itself. It had, this is quite interesting for a museum, it had a will to survive, and she was its servant and guardian. And she repeated this story, which she said showed that she was fated to create the museum, that a fortune teller had predicted that she would one day run a museum of Highland folk life. She also said that although she found it rough and uncomfortable and putting her into penury, living at and running the museum, it gave her this kind of reward of doing the right thing. So the museum is not just a representation in that sense, but it's not real either. It's some sort of performance, some sort of make-believe. And this sense of make-believe permeates the museum and its archive, and is, particularly strong, I think, in those cottage scenes. So the museum is an arena for playing with the past, and the bodily engagement with props and buildings is a source of deep sensual and emotional satisfaction and pleasure. And I think the emotional appeal of the museum is further kind of complicated by the fact that in her memoir, she always deflects talk of emotions onto the objects. She never ascribes them to herself, she ascribes them to the objects. So it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that this is an emotional style based on reticence and deflection of strong feeling. And we see that in other elite Highland women at the same who are collecting things. Just a quick mention of Hope MacDougall, who was the daughter of the chief of the clan MacDougall, a very keen collector of social history. She was known for beachcombing and midden searching. She went through people's rubbish, and she lived a frugal and simple life. She ground her own corn for flour and she wove her own cloth. So, she's clearly a bit of a bit of a local nutcase, but because of her status, she's eccentric. But we need to remember that this deep emotional engagement is with the past of a specific ethnic group, the Highlander, one which already had a firm grip on the British imagination. And she envisaged it as a home for Highlanders, my people, as she called them, wherever they might be dispersed around the world in the British Empire. And I think that what we might think is that this is the point where the imaginative and representational devices which had hitherto been used to position the other and abroad in international exhibition villages, for example, start to be used to position the self and home in heritage. There are some other forerunners, but I think this is a very clear example of a very wholesale use of some of these tropes and techniques of the native village, you know, everyday life as a sort of performance of identity. But in other ways, she very much disavows that kind of model. So she emphasises the geographical mobility of the Highlander and the historicity of a Highlander identity. You know, they change through time. If we think of this as a display of white ethnic identity, it's in marked contrast to previous museum representations of whiteness, focusing on more kind of objective historical, archaeological and scientific displays. This is about a compelling imaginative universe in which to form a sense of personal identity based on bodily identification with the people of the past. And I think it's also about drawing on other ways in which people were interacting with the past in pleasurable ways in the period. Historical novels, pageants were a huge kind of mid-20th century way in which people liked and interacted with the past. But it's got the added reality or documentary power, the sensual immediacy of actual things. I don't just think that the content of the archive shows an unauthorised approach to preservation. I think the actual archiving practices at the museum are an important part of the story. We know that the spaces, the materiality of archives are enormously important for the production of meaning. It's generally argued that archives are disciplinary, position objects, people and academic subjects. But the Highland Folk Museum, I think, is a very inefficient disciplinary archive with a capital A, because it's formed in spaces and through practices which are very domestic. Of course, it is this very kind of lack of or alternative to conventional informational systems, which meant that everyone was so sniffy about her amateurishness. The fact that the museum was where she lived is profoundly important here. And there's wonderful descriptions of her wandering around the museum at night listening for woodworm and then varnishing it. So she was literally kind of there in the collection. She lived with it. And I think that's very important. I think it is unique, but I think it points us towards the ways in which museum archives are often not as disciplinary as we might think they are, and are open to multiple readings. She's not the only person to have lived in a museum, for example. And I think whenever people do have that kind of domestic relation with a museum, it does change things profoundly. There's a marvellous description in Catherine Pearson's book on British museums during the Second World War of somebody living in the museum because their house was bomb damaged, and they used a dress from the collection for their wedding, which is interesting, isn't it? So that has a very profound effect. But nearly all museum collections do emerge at some point from the domestic setting of the original collector into the public, often trailing records which are inherently subjective and undisciplined. And I think that museum archives are working archives in the way that others aren't. They're consulted and updated on a regular basis. And this itself also means that they're spatially different to other sorts of archive. And I always say that museums don't necessarily have an archive. They have a cupboard or some boxes or a bizarre kind of accretion of boxes and cupboards and files and things like that, in which, if you're lucky and you can find a curator who knows where everything is, a wealth of material can be found. But it gives this impression of being beyond control, of almost multiplying unknowably in its cupboards and boxes than it does of actually being a kind of authorising and disciplining a system. So, in conclusion, this eccentric museum initiative in the far north of the British Isles, I think, allows us to refine how we approach 20th century heritage methodologically and conceptually. It's not uncommon for heritage institutions to have these random assemblages of archives, which are also heavily imbricated in domestic practices of memory making and keeping. And this means that they only weakly exert the forces which official knowledge does. I think we can also see that these domesticated archives show us heritage practices which focus on identity, imagination, love of the thingness of objects, desire to look after them, play with them, live with them, which show us how contemporary heritage practice derives from unauthorised as well as authorised past practices, and how unauthorised practices could celebrate a very ethnically exclusive heritage identity in much more compelling and pleasurable ways than authorised practices could. So they're really important to look at to complicate the history of heritage in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those talks. Actually, like it turned out, I think that the order that we ended up doing it just seemed to flow into each other. We'll do the same as Rodney did in the first one, which is if there's any if there are any specific questions, and then we can do kind of questions for the panel as a whole. So are there any questions that are specific for any of the presenters? Johnny?
Thanks to everyone there, all great talks. Specifically for Kate, weirdly enough, I was at the museum about 2 weeks ago and I've never heard of it before, and it's really amazing, so definitely go. Still lots of animals running around and all kinds of wild things. But I just wondered, in the context of my own interest in kind of like these world's fairs and expos and things, and the kind of often very problematic kind of human zoos and villages in that kind of thing, and also the pageants, thinking of like things like Pageant of London at the Festival of Empire, 1911, that kind of thing, the Crystal Palace. Was there any engagement between the museum and its collections, say in the 1930s, with the likes of the Glasgow Empire exhibition?
Yes.
Anything like that?
Yes, it was the Glasgow Empire exhibition that started it, actually, because she had that's 1930, wasn't it?
38, I think.
Oh, that was, there was one in, there was one little exhibition in 1930 that she had a little display at, and that's what took her forward. 1938, when she had a Rumi, which again was, so this is, because it's 1938, it's before she'd done it at open air, but she just had the kind of a chapel museum or church museum essentially. And there's a lot of interesting discussion because her friend Louis Russ was in Glasgow and she was the one who kind of checked on it, and she's talking about how the visitors respond to it, and that realer than history is a visitor response. And somebody said because there was a little mouse running around, and so that wasn't on purpose, but like, oh look, they haven't even forgotten the little mouse, and this kind of thing. And it's very, of course, that's a very interesting exhibition because there was a outdoor bit, wasn't there? There was a village. There was a Highland village, which is there's quite an interesting sort of thing on that. But this focused on the interior, and I think that interiority is quite an interesting aspect as well.
I just quickly add to it. I think it just seems that much more. Well, because it's kind of from below almost, or at least it's much more positive. If you think of, I think there was one of kind of Irish life idealised at Wembley in 1924, which was like horrendous. So it was quite nice to, well, I'm sure.
And that was soap manufacturers as well at Ballymaclinton.
Yeah.
And it's from within, you know, which isn't entirely the case with Ballymaclinton, but allegedly from within. But you know, it's very much about her. She didn't speak Gaelic. She was really embarrassed about that, and she kind of tried to pretend she did at various points of this sort of thing. So I think she's got a lot of anxiety about her own Highlandness, particularly she lives in London a lot of the time, and this kind of thing.
Any others? Wendy?
So I have 3 specific questions. They're all about gender, actually. Because what really struck me, and I don't know if this was part of the programming, was that you seem to all be talking about gender in different ways. So in relation to Mustafa, did I catch it right that Melik is female professor?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was sort of struck by the fact that the document in the archive that you found was a personal document addressed to a female archaeologist. and the contrast between that and you going as a team of archaeologists, and I was wondering how gender plays out in the ability to access people in formal and informal settings, and more specifically, I already told you how extremely excited I am about your work because I've thought about it but not done it. And so I was thinking if, in thinking about, I wanted to ask if, in thinking about engaging with the local population and their memories, whether there's been an effort to do it informally in terms of men going and hanging out at the cafe, women going and talking with women, and sort of using gender as a tool. In relation to Kate's talk, gender was sort of, seemed to me to be a huge subtext in terms of method, both in terms of this idea of the love of labor and the idea of authorization, and the implicit relationship between of Mrs. Grant as Mrs. Grant, doubly. And so I was wondering what threads you've been able to find about that and sort of the epistemic gender of what it means to be an archive. And very similarly with Rachel, what's the role of gender in collecting and recognizing the activities of the local actors in relation to the people working there, and also the notes of the woman and learning the field, and the notion of almost creating a field through a perspective of gender and what if I'm not mistaken, is the role of the wife, which is always an interesting scholarly role.
Go for it.
Well, thank you. As for the letters sent to Melnik, I only showed one, and there are more than 30, and they're all from very different places, and also different genders, basically. Just the one I picked out to show was a boy.
She's a woman.
She's a woman, yes. She's a young woman at the time, quite, just very young, as far as I can tell, assistant professor. And she's doing archaeological work, survey, in very remote places. So the only, assuming that, especially in Lycia, which is the southwestern part of Turkey, which is very rocky, and it's basically just mountain villages. So she does surveying, so that means that she goes village by village, just surveying her way through the geography. So she has to sort of establish these connections in order to continue her work. So her, I believe, intention at first hand wasn't necessarily establishing these connections, but it was like a byproduct. But as I can also say that she does archaeological work in very different parts of Turkey. Like the one example I show was from Polatlı, Gordian, and Gordian has been an American excavation since early 20th century. It's very, they still to this day the archaeological team lives in a compound, so there's not much connection actually. But it also appears that she somehow has a way of establishing these connections, because, okay, for the let's say field work in more rocky terrains, it makes sense that it just became, but in certain ways she must be approaching somehow to people to make friendships, because there are cases that there are multiple letters exchanged over a decade with a male counterpart. And in my case, I had the sort of limitation of having not enough, but like necessary permits to do this kind of thing, because the site that I mentioned, Miletus, is still dug by a German archaeological team, and that requires a lot of government permits. And I was part of the team just because I could talk to these people, so that I don't cause any, let's say, unnecessary problems. That's why I always had to go with a group. But I believe, like, if I were to go again, so, since I introduced myself to the people, it will have a different, that requires year after year, and my sort of connection is always through the, not always, but like, it still necessitates sort of arranged by being the member of the archaeological team, more or less?
It's enormously gendered. All of it is enormously gendered. If you look more widely at folk museums and social history museums in the interwar period, it's women everywhere, or men who are outsiders. There's a few men who are outsiders, but nevertheless, it's driven by women. Laura Carter's written a... Sorry?
What's an outsider?
Somebody who all the other male curators don't recognise as a proper person to be a curator, to found a folk museum. Laura Carter's written a really interesting article about this sort of thing in popular history publishing using things. So there's a lot of popular history where they talk about clothes in the past and everyday life in the past as being a way for women to be professional historians in the interwar period. They couldn't do any other way, and they sort of stake this out as their sort of thing. And that's definitely true. It is about, you know, not being able to do history any other way and finding a way to do history this way. But I'm just really interested in the. I found her because I was looking for music for women and at women, and I wrote about women in museums in the 19th century, came into the 20th century. But what you see is that women do explicitly bring domestic practices into public through museums in various ways. So, partly it's about the objects that they value, but it's also about the way they do it. It's about who they communicate it to. So, bringing children into museums for the first time and this kind of thing. So there's an enormous sense in which, they can't do professional practice the way men can, and they have to do it this way. But there's also that sort of more positive sense that this is actually about sort of calling out that professional, that objectivity, and saying this is another kind of aspect of the past that we can do differently.
Sort of two sets of questions in your question, Wendy. Number one about sort of the gender in collecting and recognizing the role of local actors, and then also in creating a field through gender, which that last phrase is one that I quite like a lot. Let's take the second part first. So Marion Howe joined a pretty sizable, surprisingly, cohort of women field assistants in natural sciences in Southern Africa, and they were quite commonly field assistants in botany, rock art, less so in archaeology, but still present. Marion Howe was quite different, though, from the others in that none of the other women, to my knowledge, sort of played a role in designing an experiment as such. However you want to, I refer to her painting foray as an experiment in a very loose sense of the word, but recognizably it kind of is. The others were copyists and field technicians who would go along with other, usually male field researchers to help them in their work. As a wife, I think that you're exactly right. There's a certain amount of gender domesticity happening in this archive, but I think also that Marion was in a very privileged position in this way because she had social currency, she had social authority, she had social privilege because she came from this dynasty of missionaries that had been in Lesotho for years and years and years. And so her access to these spaces was not through her husband, it was through her family herself. I think leading into the second part of your question, what's important to qualify about this, though, is that we're talking about Marion's access contingent on a specific performance of white domestic gender. In the archives, African voices, especially black women, are very, very infrequent. The only place you see them are in marriage documents, marriage and baptism documents. David Frederick, Ellen Berger, and others only collected testimony from men. They didn't really collect any information from women at all, for various reasons. And elsewhere, while Ellen Berger was doing his research, there was a really vibrant generation of mission-educated black historians coming to the fore who produced absolutely incredible work. And Ellen Berger, in doing his own research, in his archive takes huge issue with this quality of the scholarship from these historians, all of whom were men. And his criticism has basis. It's a very hypocritical kind of criticism. He says these are people who are too close to the action. They can't produce good history as a result of it. I've written about this a lot in a book that's actually just come out this month. And so what you see is authority being constituted around these really complicated nodes, but ultimately, I think what I find the most compelling about this is that science and scientific authority is rooted in family and rooted in establishing a genealogy of these things, which is quite interesting to think with.
Any other questions? I think I saw one. No? Wait, do you have any questions for each other? Tricky. No. All right. Okay, yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask Kemal, because you mentioned the opportunity or the chance to maybe have some more informal encounters with the locals, and but how would you do that? So how would these informal encounters look like, given, as you mentioned, you are already identified with the archaeological team? Are there ways to elicit information in an informal way, and would they still be able to be ethically, justified?
That's a very good question, which I don't necessarily have a direct answer right now. But while I was introduced to part of the excavation team, I was also introduced as someone who was not digging with them. So it was just someone who was interested in the project and the area, history of the area, but not necessarily. It's because also the team is German, so I was not the German one at the time when I was introduced. So I was still the one who was, well, the others were also speaking in Turkish, but I had that sort of, I guess, familiarity with them, as well as, yeah. In terms of, in the context of my dissertation, let's say, I won't be able to do it at this stage because I need to go through certain permissions and ethical board reviews. So it won't be through the dissertation, but at the next stage in my research, I would maybe try to go beyond a bit within the academic framework, and just in order to get that story in a more informal, or I'm having a bit trouble in terms of describing that adjective, like I don't want to say creative, but just something that is a little bit beyond what I've already done, especially with the scholars of archaeology who I interviewed.
Yeah, at the back.
Yes, also a question for Kemal, or is it Mustafa?
Kemal usually, but it's fine.
I'm interested in the displacement of the inhabitants of the site of Aphrodisias and the movement to modern Gary. And in one of the quotations about the family who was displaced and the children were crying and they didn't want to go to modern Gary, have you any knowledge of how far those people who were displaced preserve any kind of memory of the life that they used to live in Aphrodisias, whether they're interested in going back, if that's at all possible, or what they value from where they used to live compared with the modern site in Gary?
Well, I didn't yet conduct a series of interviews as I did in my Litus, but the interesting thing is that there are a series of houses from the old village Gere that is on site right now, which are used by the excavation team and the on-site museum. So some of the houses are there, presumably the largest and the most, the ones belong to the more richer members of the village. So these are very well restored by the, especially the restoration team of the excavation. So these are there, and when certain descendants of that village, when they come, they must see and have an association one way or another. But I don't really have a personal account of what the people in the village have on their minds in terms of the remaining villages. But there was a similar study done on a another classical site in Turkey, Sagalassos, which is slightly bit further down. And a scholar conducted those kind of interviews, and this is a very remote place on top of a mountain, and she discovered that the villagers have this had this habit before the excavation started of going around the ruins as some sort of a stroll, and they would always meet as a kid and run around the ancient ruins when they were kids. But of course, with the start of the modern excavations, that practice didn't survive.
Whose work is that?
I will remember the last name. It's on my Facebook.
All the time, yeah. I know that feeling.
Any more? Oh, Colin?
A question for Rachel, but maybe also Kate a bit. I'm really struck by this, the resisting the division between words and things, which I think is vital. And it's something that I see a lot in photography research, definitely. The thingliness of images has been central to that field for a while now. But I'm just wondering, it's kind of really important and in academic knowledge production, but I'm just wondering about broader knowledge production, to what extent that sense of thingliness can be expanded through different forms of writing and making exhibitions or whatever, other forms of knowledge and heritage practice that could be done around these kinds of archives and collections. And then whether any of that's kind of been explored with, we were talking at lunch about speculative fiction, whether stuff like that could be done. And then I was struck by both the texts that you mentioned that these women had written, where they were actually really kind of poetic and personal and emotional, and then there's just kind of chunks of information dropped in. And what that tells us about the possibility for writing this stuff in other ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. So I think for me, it's really not difficult at all to see how that division sort of breaks down when you look at other ways of experiencing African history, for instance. And so I think a lot about work by Karen Barber on Yoruba Oriki, which are poems. It's not right to call them poems. They are spoken performance pieces that are intimately tied to narrating the life histories of towns and specific places and the roles of families in those towns. And she has this absolutely fabulous book from 1981 or 84, I can't remember the year, called I Could Speak Until Tomorrow, which is just like a mind-blowing thing. I Could Speak Until Tomorrow, that's what it's called. And what she describes there is how the ontology of physical space is intimately tied to spoken word performance, and how this performance is intergenerational, and it encapsulates the need to dissolve that boundary really well. And this work is sort of a cornerstone of literature on popular culture in Africa. And so I come back to this constantly, and it's something I want to bring a lot more into my own practice of thinking about how performance and performative space sort of plays into this. So that's very much a work in progress for me as an academic. But I think just building onto the second part of what you're saying is that I think that what we see certainly in my case and perhaps in yours is sort of this experiment, so this uncertainty around what is the genre in which you're writing as a woman during these time periods, and being rather uncomfortable with it, whether, you know, out of anxiety on many different levels, basically. And it's that experimentation that I find really, really fascinating about this. And there is something to that kind of chafing that I think is quite productive, actually.
Yeah, so I'm a historian and I teach history students, don't teach heritage students or archaeology students or anything like that. And I think this is really important. And when I started doing the Women in Museums book, I was looking at women's collections, and the problem with them is that they don't exist anymore, most of them. So you can't do a material history in the sense that there are quite a lot of books about now, you know, about you taking the material seriously and that kind of thing. You can't do that because it's, you know, these were small value collections that it's impossible to identify them if they are there. They're not on display, certainly, and a lot of them have been lost or destroyed over time. But the intersection is a more productive area, I think, and that's what what I try to get students to think with, that kind of thing. They're quite resistant, I have to say. They're just down the line, text, give me text. Occasionally a bit of oral history, but that's that's about as far as they're going to go in terms of that sort of thing. And I did hear Elizabeth Edwards talk just last week further about how the materiality of photographs in museums works, and I came back thinking I must put that in my talk next week, and I haven't quite got there yet, but I think certainly it did make me look at certainly those photograph albums and their handwritten captions in quite a different way.
Well, we are done, but is there any last, with the session that is, but is there any last pressing question that anyone has? Yeah, Miriam?
Yeah, we said that around 3 o'clock we make a slow transition to more general discussion, so we want to invite all speakers, keynote speakers, audience members to share their reflections or ask each other questions about the last 2 days really, or general thoughts on counter archives. But I had a last question for the panel. I was really intrigued by Kate's comments that museums don't have archives, but they have cupboards, drawers, and boxes. And I think everyone who worked on museum history thought, oh yes, that's exactly what it is. And you also said you need to be lucky. If you're lucky, you find someone to help you to find something in these boxes and boxes. So I wondered, it kind of made me think, well, really, there are not really many archives. They're mainly counter archives, of which people don't even know that they exist. You often just stumble on them, and then it's up to us whether we want to tell these counter histories when we work with them. And so really my question is, in how far do we need to be insiders, and how far do we need to have contact, and almost be like one of them in order to get access to the archaeological side, to the cupboards and to the boxes, or to do the ethnography and to do the historical research that we want to do. And then how far would that insider role then almost hinder us to write these counter histories? Or you, what I like.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think, it comes back to the emotions in the archive as well, and the sense that you follow what you fall in love with to an extent, or sometimes that you are appalled by, but there's that kind of, it compels you, and I think that that can put you inside or outside in some senses, can't it? I was looking at, because I was done with women, so I was looking at masculinity in curators in the late 19th century, and the curator who, again, absolutely opened me up to all sorts of things like that, and he said, "Oh, I love him, this particular curator. We've got all of this stuff," and he was literally the only person who knew about some of these things, including a really interesting transcribed oral history interview with somebody who'd worked there in the early 20th century and things like that. And his sense was nobody else is interested in this stuff. He wouldn't consider putting it on display or anything like that because it's too navel-gazy, and somebody used that phrase already today or yesterday. So I think it is, can be an issue, can be a problem, can be about insiders and outsiders, definitely.
I would also add that archives, yes, you do have to have some insider status to access them and understand them, but also they make you an insider.
Yeah.
The longer you spend with them, you become sucked into their vocabulary. This is where I love Carolyn Stevens' work so much, because she writes so much. She writes about that as a literal archive fever. That the longer you spend in archive, the dust enters your bloodstream and it gives you asthma, and you become physically in pain and ill from working with these things, and it becomes this thing that kind of entraps you. And I mean, that was certainly my experience working, not the illness bit, but the entrapment was very much my experience working with archive, and how I've come into it. So yeah.
Well, in my case, I visit a very sort of a different, because I can't really answer with one particular institution or archive in mind. But I would say in most of the cases, I came as an outsider, being someone who doesn't go to excavations as, you know, as a field archaeologist. So when I even use the word archive, it almost immediately becomes, it has a different meaning in the field archaeologist's mind. And it's often with the German speaker archaeologists, it's always, I would want the unscientific material, because scientific material would refer to the drawings, photographs of buildings and stratigraphy and whatnot. But particularly in what I'm interested, wouldn't even necessarily be kept in the first place. I don't know if this answers your question, but yeah. Because I'm basically someone outside the field, in most of the people's eyes, who is interested in things that are not necessarily related with archaeology, even though I claim the opposite, exact opposite.
All right. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our speakers again. And then are we going to have, we're not going to have all the speakers.